The woods don't forgive. Hit subscribe, then comment what state you're watching from. Here's what happened to Barb. Barbara Walsh turned 67 that winter. She didn't celebrate. There was no one left to mark the day. No cards in the mailbox. No phone calls that meant anything. Just another morning in the cabin, another log on the fire, another cup of coffee drunk alone at the table where her husband used to sit. The cabin sat 12 miles outside Whitefish, Montana, tucked into the western edge of the Flathead National Forest, trees pressed close on 3 sides. The fourth opened onto a meadow that disappeared under snow each November and didn't resurface until April. Tom had built the place with his own hands back in '82, when they were young enough to believe isolation meant freedom. They'd raised 2 boys here, watched them grow tall and restless, then watched them leave for cities that promised more than silence and firewood. That was 20 years gone now. The boys called on Christmas if they remembered. One lived in Portland doing something with computers. The other had moved to Denver, married a woman Barb met once at a funeral. They had kids she'd never held. Tom died 3 years back. Heart attack while splitting wood. She found him face down in the snow, the axe still in his hand, his body already cold. The day had been clear, the sky that particular shade of blue that only comes in mountain country. She remembered thinking how wrong it was, how death should arrive with storms, not sunlight. She buried him in town. The service was small. After, she drove back to the cabin and kept living because she didn't know what else to do. The Social Security came monthly. Her joints complained when the weather turned. The TV worked when it felt like it, picking up 3 channels if the antenna was angled right. Most nights, she didn't bother turning it on. Her days followed patterns worn smooth by repetition. She rose at dawn regardless of season, started the fire, boiled water for instant coffee that tasted like bitter regret, ate oatmeal or toast, sometimes both, if her appetite allowed. Then she moved through the cabin's 4 rooms, straightening what didn't need straightening, checking supplies, counting days until the next town run. The hardest part was evening. The hours between dinner and sleep stretched long. She'd sit in Tom's chair, the one by the fire, and feel the silence press against her skin. Sometimes she talked out loud, just to hear a voice. Sometimes she read the same mystery novels over and over, the endings never surprising because she'd memorized them years ago. The loneliness had texture. It wasn't the ache of fresh grief anymore, that had dulled, worn down like river stones. This was deeper, permanent, the kind that settled in your bones and made you forget what it felt like to matter to someone. December came in hard that year. The first snow hit before Thanksgiving and never really stopped. Each storm laid down another 6 inches, then another 12. The road to town became impassable without chains. Barb's old Ford truck sat buried to the wheel wells. She had supplies enough canned goods, rice, beans, flour, coffee, and she'd stacked firewood to the rafters before the season turned. She could wait out winter. She'd done it before. But this storm was different. It arrived the week before Christmas, rolling down from Canada with a particular fury. The radio called it a once-in-a-generation system, the kind that shut down highways and trapped people in their homes. Wind speeds hit 60 miles per hour. Temperatures dropped to 15 below. Snow came in horizontal sheets that buried everything in white. Barb watched it through the cabin windows, the world disappearing behind walls of white. She fed the fire, checked the propane, made sure the path to the woodshed stayed clear, though it was filling fast. By nightfall on the second day, she was completely cut off. No phone service, no radio signal, no way out, and no way for anyone to reach her. Not that anyone would try. She sat by the fire that evening, listening to the wind scream around the cabin's corners. The walls shook, the windows rattled. Snow found every crack, dusting the floor beneath the sills. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stared into the flames, thinking about Tom, about the boys who never called, about all the years that had passed, and all the ones still ahead. That's when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A knock, heavy, deliberate. 3 strikes against the door. Barb froze. Her first thought was that she'd imagined it. Branches hit the cabin all the time in high wind. Could have been ice falling from the roof. Could have been anything. Then it came again, louder, more insistent. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. No one came out here during storms like this. The road was gone. Even the Forest Service guys stayed home when the weather turned this bad. She sat perfectly still, blanket clutched tight, watching the door. The knock repeated. This time it rattled the hinges. Something was out there. Something big enough to shake a door that Tom had built to withstand bears. Barb's mind raced through possibilities. None of them good. Mountain lion wouldn't knock. Neither would a wolf. Maybe a person, lost and desperate. But what kind of fool wandered the forest in this? She stood slowly. Her knees protested. Everything hurt when you got old joints. Back. The deep ache in your chest where grief lived. She moved to the door, one hand reaching for the hunting rifle Tom had kept mounted on the wall. The metal was cold against her palm. She hadn't fired it in 3 years. Wasn't even sure it still worked, but it felt like something. And something was better than nothing. Who's there? Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. No answer. Just the wind and another knock. This one almost gentle, patient. Like whatever stood outside knew it needed permission. Barb's hand found the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at her to leave it closed, to back away, to let the storm keep whatever was out there on the other side. But something in that patient knocking spoke of desperation, not danger. She'd heard desperation before, recognized its particular rhythm. She turned the knob and pulled. The door swung inward, and the storm rushed in with it, snow and wind filling the cabin with cold that had teeth. But Barb barely felt it. Her eyes were locked on the figure in the doorway. It stood 8 feet tall, maybe more, shoulders broad as a door frame, fur the color of old pine bark, matted with snow and ice, arms thick as fence posts, one wrapped around something small and shivering, eyes that caught the firelight and reflected it back, not animal stupid but aware, intelligent, afraid, a female. Barb knew it immediately, the way you know some things without needing proof. She'd spent 40 years raising sons, caring for family, reading the silent language of need. This was a mother, and the small thing clutched against her chest, barely visible through the fur and snow, was her child. The creature didn't move, just stood there in the doorway, snow building on her shoulders, breathing hard. Her eyes met Barb's and held, not threatening, pleading. The child made a sound, weak, thin, a cry that barely cut through the wind. Time stretched. Barb should have slammed the door, should have grabbed the rifle, backed away, done any of the things a reasonable person would do when faced with something that wasn't supposed to exist. Instead, she saw her own reflection in that desperate gaze. She saw Tom dying alone in the snow. Her boys, gone to places that didn't need her. Years of loneliness stacked like cordwood. And she saw this mother, standing in a storm, holding her child, asking for the one thing Barb had always been able to give. Shelter. She stepped back, pulled the door wider. Get in here before you both freeze to death. The words came out rough, practical, like inviting in a neighbor instead of something from nightmare. The creature hesitated, then ducked through the doorway, careful not to brush the frame. Snow fell from her fur in clumps, melting on the floor in dark pools. Barb closed the door, the storm's howl muffled to a distant roar. The cabin, small before, felt smaller now. The creature filled the space, her bulk making the furniture look like dollhouse pieces. But she moved with surprising care, keeping her distance, eyes darting between Barb and the fire. The child whimpered again. The mother looked down, then back at Barb, that pleading expression still written clear across her face. Barb set the rifle down, slowly, making sure the movement was visible, non-threatening. Then she moved to the linen closet and pulled out 2 heavy wool blankets, the good ones Tom had bought at a church sale years ago. Put her down by the fire. Barb's voice was steady now. get her warm. The creature studied her for a long moment. Then, with movements that spoke of exhaustion deeper than Barb had ever known, she lowered herself to the floor near the hearth. The child came with her, still clutched tight. But as the warmth from the fire reached them both, the mother finally loosened her grip. The little one couldn't have been more than 3 years old if you measured such things in human terms. Its fur was sparse in patches, skin showing through pink and vulnerable. Its eyes, huge and dark, blinked slowly in the firelight. It looked at Barb without fear, just the blank exhaustion of something too tired to be afraid anymore. Barb spread the blankets within reach. The mother took them carefully, wrapping one around the child, keeping the other for herself. Then she sat there, rocking slightly, holding her baby close, watching Barb with eyes that held questions no language could ask. The cabin settled into a new silence. Not the empty kind Barb had grown used to, but something different, shared. 3 beings breathing in the same space, the storm locked outside, the fire crackling between them. Barb moved to the kitchen, put water on to boil. Her hands shook as she worked, adrenaline and disbelief mixing into something that felt almost like purpose. She made tea, added honey, poured it into her sturdiest mugs, and brought one over, setting it carefully on the floor within the mother's reach. The creature sniffed it, looked at Barb. Then, with movements almost delicate, lifted the mug and pressed it to the child's lips. The little one drank in small sips, steam rising into its face. Only after the child had drunk its fill did the mother take the mug herself. She drank deeply, her eyes closing briefly, something like relief crossing her features. Barb stood back. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this wasn't happening, couldn't be happening. Bigfoot was a story, a legend, something drunk loggers claimed to see, and tourists paid money to hunt with cameras. It wasn't real. It didn't knock on cabin doors during blizzards. But here it's Saturday, real as the fire, real as the snow piling against the windows, real as the ache in Barb's knees and the gray in her hair, and every lonely day she'd survived since Tom died. She'd opened the door to a myth, and the myth was just a mother trying to keep her child alive. The thought settled over her with unexpected weight. Not fear anymore. Something closer to recognition. She pulled Tom's chair closer to the fire, and Saturday, the mother watched her, still cautious, but the edge of panic had dulled. They sat like that as the storm raged, 2 mothers in a cabin, the space between them filled with firelight and silence, and the sound of wind trying to break through walls. Hours passed. Barb fed the fire. The child slept, curled against its mother's chest, breathing steady now. The mother's eyes drooped, but she fought sleep, her gaze constantly moving, checking the child, checking Barb, checking the door, as if expecting it to burst open any moment. Barb understood. Trust was expensive. You didn't give it freely, especially when you had something precious to lose. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said quietly. "Either of you." The mother's eyes fixed on her. Whether she understood the words or just the tone, Barb couldn't tell. But something in the creature's posture softened, not relaxed, but less rigid, less ready to fight or run. The night deepened. The fire burned low. Barb added more wood, the routine familiar, comforting. The mother watched her every movement, learning the pattern, maybe deciding whether to trust it. Eventually, exhaustion won. The mother's eyes closed. Her breathing deepened. She slept sitting up, one massive arm still wrapped protectively around the child. Even unconscious, she maintained her guard. Barb sat in Tom's chair, wrapped in a blanket, watching them. The surreal had become mundane. A Bigfoot slept in her living room, a child not human, but a child nonetheless dreamed by her fire. The storm still hammered the windows. Snow still piled against the walls. But inside, the cabin held, warm and dry, and filled with breathing that wasn't just her own. For the first time in 3 years, Barb didn't feel alone. She must have dozed. When she woke, gray dawn light filtered through the windows. The storm hadn't broken. Snow still fell. Wind still howled. but it had backed off enough to see shapes in the whiteness outside. The mother was awake, watching her. The child still slept, its small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Barb stood, joints popping, and moved to the kitchen. Her guests needed more than tea. She pulled out oatmeal, canned milk, honey, put water on to boil, made enough for 3, though she had no idea what a Bigfoot ate or if it would eat human food at all. The smell of cooking drew the mother's attention. She shifted slightly, careful not to wake the child, her nose lifting to track the scent. When Barb brought over 2 bowls, the mother's eyes widened. Barb set them down, then backed away, giving space. The mother reached out slowly, testing. Her hands, massive and furred, held the bowl with surprising gentleness. She brought it to her nose, sniffed, then looked at Barb. "It's okay," Barb said. "It's food. You need to eat." The mother held the bowl toward the child, who was waking now, stretching in that way children do regardless of species. Small hands reached up. The mother helped guide the bowl, making sure each spoonful reached the little one's mouth. Barb watched. The mother didn't take a single bite until the child had eaten its fill. Only then did she pick up the second bowl, eating quickly, efficiently, the hunger in her movements speaking of days or maybe weeks without enough. When the food was gone, Barb brought more. This time, the mother didn't wait for the child. She ate while her baby played with the blanket, small fingers exploring its texture with fascination. The pattern repeated through that day and the next. The storm continued, sometimes fierce, sometimes settling into steady snowfall that added inches by the hour. Barb's world shrank to the cabin's 4 walls, the fire, the unlikely presence of her guests. She learned their rhythms. The mother was always awake before her, sitting alert by the fire, checking on her child. The little one grew stronger with each meal, its movements more energetic, less lethargic. It started exploring the cabin, staying close to its mother, but curious. It touched the furniture, the books, the windows, learning the space with small hands and wide eyes. The mother never fully relaxed, but the sharpness of her vigilance eased. She watched Barb less like a threat and more like. Barb struggled for the word. A host, maybe, or something else, entirely. On the 3rd day, Barb was washing dishes when she felt eyes on her back. She turned. The child stood closer than it had come before, watching her hands move through the soapy water. Its expression held pure curiosity, the way Tom's boys used to watch her cook when they were small, trying to understand the alchemy of making something from nothing. Barb held still. The child reached out, one small hand hovering near the water. Then it touched, just the fingertips, pulling back at the warmth. It looked up at Barb, something like wonder in its face. "It's warm," Barb said softly. "Feels good, doesn't it?" The child touched the water again, this time with more confidence. It splashed a little, delighted by the sound. A small laugh escaped it, a sound so human it made Barb's chest ache. The mother made a soft noise, not warning, just awareness. The child looked back, and the mother gestured. The little one returned immediately, climbing into its mother's lap, but it kept glancing at Barb. Not with fear, with interest. Something had shifted. That night, while the child slept, the mother did something unexpected. She rose, moved to the window, and looked out at the storm. Then she turned to Barb and made a gesture, hands moving up and down, then outward. It took Barb a moment to understand. Snow, the storm. How much? "It's still bad," Barb said, moving to stand beside her. "Probably another day or 2 before it breaks." The mother looked at her, really looked, like she was trying to understand not just the words, but the woman speaking them. Then she did something that stopped Barb's breath. She reached out and touched Barb's hand, just lightly, a brush of fur against skin. Then she pulled back, returning to her place by the fire. But the message was clear. Gratitude, trust, recognition of what was being given. Barb stood at the window long after the mother had settled. Her hand tingled where it had been touched. Outside, Snow continued to fall. Inside, the fire burned steady. And in that small cabin, 12 miles from anywhere that mattered, two mothers who shouldn't have understood each other somehow did. The storm broke on the 5th day. Barb woke to silence the particular quiet that comes after days of wind. She rose, moved to the window. The world outside was buried under 4 feet of fresh snow, but the sky had cleared. Pale blue stretched from horizon to horizon, clean and cold. She knew what it meant. The roads would be dug out soon. The Forest Service would check on cabins. Life would return to what passed for normal, and her guests would need to leave before that happened. Not because Barb wanted them gone, but because the world outside this cabin wouldn't understand. Couldn't understand. The mother knew it too. Barb saw it in how she moved that morning, gathering the blankets, touching the child's face with particular tenderness, looking toward the door with something like dread. They needed to leave, but neither was ready. Barb made breakfast, used the last of the oatmeal, added extra honey. They ate in silence, the child still playful but subdued, picking up on its mother's tension. After, Barb packed food in a canvas bag: bread, jerky, dried fruit, things that would travel. She set it by the door. The mother watched, understanding everything. The morning stretched long. They sat by the fire, not speaking, just being. The child dozed in its mother's arms. The mother stared into the flames. Barb sat in Tom's chair, memorizing this moment, knowing it would be the last. Around noon, the mother stood. The child woke, confused at first, then seeming to understand. It clung to its mother's fur. The mother moved to the door, then paused. She turned back to Barb, and for a long moment, they just looked at each other. Two women who had survived storms together. Two mothers who had shared the most basic of living experiences. Giving shelter, sharing food, protecting the young. Barb's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, but all the words felt wrong. Too small for what had passed between them. The mother solved it. She pressed one hand to her chest, then extended it toward Barb. Then she opened the door. Cold air rushed in, but the wind was gone. Just stillness and sunlight on snow. The mother stepped through. The child held close. She walked 10 feet, 20, then stopped and turned back one final time. Barb stood in the doorway, watching them. The mother stared at her across the snow, and Barb could swear she saw something in those eyes that went beyond animal recognition. Something deeper, fuller, a gratitude that had no words, because words would have been insufficient. Then the mother turned and walked into the forest. Her tracks pressed deep into the fresh snow. The child's face appeared over her shoulder, looking back, one small hand raised in what might have been a wave. They reached the tree line and didn't pause. Disappeared into the shadows between the pines, like they'd never existed at all. Barb stood in the doorway until her feet went numb from cold. The forest was empty, silent. Just trees and snow and the particular loneliness of Montana winter. She closed the door slowly. The cabin felt different now. Not bigger, but emptier, in a way it hadn't been before. The blankets lay folded by the fire. The bowls sat washed and drying by the sink, everything back in its place. But something had changed. Something fundamental in the architecture of what Barb understood about the world. She sat in Tom's chair, and the tears came then. Not sad, exactly. Not happy either. Something else. Relief, maybe. Or recognition. The knowledge that she'd been seen, that she'd mattered, if only for 5 days, if only to a creature that wasn't supposed to exist. The phone lines came back 2 days later. Barb didn't call anyone. What would she say? Who would believe her? The Forest Service came by, checking on residents after the storm. She told them she was fine, had enough supplies, didn't need anything. They looked around, saw nothing unusual, and left. Life returned to its patterns. Fire in the morning, coffee, meals eaten alone, long evenings by the hearth. But now when Barb sat in Tom's chair, she wasn't quite alone. The memory sat with her, the knowledge of what she'd done, who she'd sheltered. At night, before sleep, she'd look out the window toward the tree line and wonder, were they out there? Had they survived? Did the mother ever think about those 5 days? Did she tell others? If there were others about the old woman who'd opened her door, Barb would never know. But sometimes, in the quiet, before dawn, she thought she heard something in the forest. Not wind, not animals. Something that moved with purpose and weight. Something that remembered. The weeks passed. January turned to February. Snow still fell, but lighter now. Spring's promise buried in each storm. Barb kept to her routine, but something had loosened in her chest. The loneliness was still there that hadn't changed, but it felt different now. Less like drowning, more like floating. She'd been needed once. She'd opened her door when every instinct said to keep it closed. She'd chosen compassion over fear. That had to count for something. The cabin held its secrets. The floor still bore faint stains where snow had melted from fur. At night, when the fire burned low, Barb could almost see them there again. Mother and child curled by the hearth, breathing in rhythm, trusting her enough to sleep. Some nights, she talked to them, told them about her day, about Tom, about the boys who never called. Talked like they could hear her across whatever distance separated her cabin from their forest home. Maybe they could, maybe they couldn't. It didn't matter. Speaking into silence felt different now. Less empty, more like prayer. March arrived. The snow began its slow retreat. Roads cleared. Supplies came easier. Barb made a run into Whitefish, stocked up on essentials. In the grocery store, she heard people talking about the storm, how bad it had been, how isolated they'd felt. She wanted to tell them they didn't know isolation, didn't know what it meant to be truly cut off, truly alone, until something impossible knocked on your door and made you remember what it felt like to matter. But she kept quiet, paid for her groceries, drove home. That evening, as dusk settled over the mountains, Barb stood at her window looking toward the forest. The trees stood dark against the fading light, keeping their secrets the way forests do. Somewhere out there, maybe close, maybe miles away, a mother walked with her child, teaching it to survive, to be careful, to watch for danger from the world of men. Barb pressed her hand against the cold glass. "Be safe," she whispered. "Both of you. Stay hidden." The forest didn't answer. It never did. But later that night, as Barb was banking the fire before bed, she heard something outside. Not a knock this time, just a sound. Heavy footsteps in snow, moving slow, deliberate, coming close to the cabin, then moving away. She went to the window, saw nothing but darkness and trees. But there, at the edge of the meadow where moonlight caught the snow, she saw them. Fresh tracks, too big to be human, too purposeful to be random, leading up to the cabin wall, then away again into the forest. A visit, or a message, or just checking, making sure the old woman who'd helped them was still here, still okay, still alive in her lonely cabin. Barb stood at the window until the cold drove her back to the fire. Her hands shook as she added another log. Not from fear, from something that felt almost like joy. They'd come back. Not for shelter, the night was clear, temperatures mild for March. They'd come back, just to check on her. She mattered, still mattered. To someone, somewhere, she wasn't forgotten. That night, Barb slept better than she had in 3 years. When she woke, the tracks were still there, pressed deep in the snow. She left them undisturbed, let them fade naturally over the coming weeks as spring worked its slow magic on the mountain. The calendar turned. April brought mud and rain. May brought wildflowers to the meadow. The cabin settled into summer's easier rhythms. Barb tended her small garden, fixed the fence, did all the things a person living alone has to do. But now when she worked, she felt eyes watching sometimes. Nothing threatening, just presence, awareness, like the forest itself had taken note of her, decided she was worth keeping alive. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe grief had finally broken something in her brain and she was slowly losing touch with reality. Or maybe, just maybe, she'd become part of something larger than her own loneliness. The boys called on her birthday. Both of them, coincidentally, within hours of each other, asked how she was doing, said they worried about her up there alone, suggested, gently, that maybe it was time to think about moving closer to town, or even coming to stay with one of them. Barb listened, thanked them, said she was fine. Better than fine, actually. That the cabin was home and she wasn't ready to leave it. They didn't push, just made her promise to call if she needed anything. She agreed, knowing she wouldn't. Her needs weren't the kind that could be met by phone calls from sons who'd built lives far away from Montana mountains. Summer peaked. The meadow exploded with color. Barb sat on her porch in the evenings, watching sunset paint the sky orange and red. Sometimes, at the edge of the tree line, she thought she saw movement, large shapes that stayed in shadow, never quite visible, never quite proven. She started leaving food out. Nothing obvious. Just scraps from dinner set on a stump at the meadow's edge. By morning, they were always gone. Could have been bears, could have been ravens, could have been something else. Barb didn't need proof. The tracks in March had been enough. Autumn arrived with its particular sadness. Leaves turned gold and fell. The meadow dried to brown. Cold seeped back into the morning air. Barb stacked firewood, checked supplies, prepared for another winter. She was older now, 68. Her knees hurt worse. The stairs to the loft left her winded. Some mornings she woke and wondered if this would be the day her body just quit, the way Tom's had. Sudden, final, leaving nothing but an empty cabin and a truck rusting under snow. The thought didn't scare her like it used to. Something about sheltering those two, about being needed again, had changed her relationship with death. She'd done something that mattered, given something precious: safety, warmth, kindness. If she died tomorrow, that would still be true. That would still count. October turned to November. The first snow came, light at first, just a dusting, then heavier, winter announcing its return with the same cold indifference it always had. Barb sat by her fire one evening, listening to wind test the cabin's walls. The anniversary was coming. A year since the storm, a year since the knock. She wondered if they remembered, if the mother told her child, when the snow came, about the time they'd found shelter with an old woman who'd opened her door despite every reason not to. Probably not. Animals didn't work that way. Or did they? How much of what Barb had seen in those 5 days had been animal, and how much something else? Something closer to what she was? The question had no answer. Maybe that was fine. Maybe some mysteries were meant to stay mysterious. The wind picked up. Snow began to fall heavier. Another storm building, though not like last year's. Nothing that fierce. Just winter, doing what winter does. Barb added a log to the fire, made tea, sat in Tom's chair with a blanket over her legs. The cabin creaked around her, settling into the cold. Outside, the world disappeared behind white walls. She was alone again, had been alone all along, really. Those 5 days were an exception, not a rule, but they'd changed something fundamental in how she experienced solitude. It wasn't quite loneliness anymore, more like waiting, like knowing that even in the deepest isolation, connection was possible, had happened once, might happen. A knock. Barb's heart stopped, then kicked hard, racing. She stood too fast, dizzy with it, moved to the door, her hand on the knob shook. This was it. They'd come back, through another storm, another desperate night, needing shelter again, and she'd give it. Of course she would. Every time. Forever. She pulled the door open. Empty darkness stared back. Snow fell through the porchlight's circle, heavy and silent. The forest beyond was black. No movement, no shape, no desperate eyes meeting hers across the threshold. Barb stepped onto the porch, cold biting through her socks. Looked left, right, nothing. The meadow lay empty under fresh snow. The tree line stood dark and still, but there, pressed into the snow at the bottom of her steps, tracks. Fresh, deep, leading up to the door, then away again toward the forest. Too large for any man, too purposeful to be coincidence. They'd been here, just seconds before. Close enough to knock, then gone again into the night. Barb's breath came fast, clouding the air. She wanted to call out, wanted to run after them, but her body wouldn't move, and her voice caught in her throat. The tracks disappeared into shadow. The forest swallowed them whole. She stood there until her feet went numb, until she started shivering hard enough that her teeth chattered. Only then did she go back inside, closing the door against the cold. But she didn't lock it. Couldn't. Just in case they came back. Just in case they needed her again. She sat by the fire the rest of that night, wrapped in blankets, watching the door, listening for another knock that never came. By dawn, the snow had covered the tracks, evidence erased, leaving only memory and the ache of almost. The pattern repeated. Every few weeks through that winter, she'd hear it. Sometimes a knock, sometimes just footsteps circling the cabin. Once, she woke at 3 a.m. to find a deer carcass on her porch, gutted clean, meat still warm, no tracks leading to it, no sign of who'd left it. But she knew. The mother was checking on her, making sure she had food, making sure she wasn't alone in a way that mattered. Barb started talking when she heard the sounds. Spoke through the door, through the walls, told stories about Tom, about the boys, about the long quiet years. Talked like the mother could understand, could hear, could care. Maybe she did. January became February. The anniversary passed. Barb marked it privately, sitting by the fire with 2 extra mugs of tea set out like the mother and child might walk through the door any moment. They didn't, but the gesture felt important anyway. March brought a thaw. Then another storm, vicious and sudden. Barb woke to wind screaming and snow hitting the windows like thrown gravel. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Power went out. Phone lines went dead. She'd been through this before, knew what to do. Built up the fire, lit candles, rationed supplies, settled in to wait it out. But this time, she wasn't worried. Not really. Because if it got bad enough, if she needed help, something in her knew the forest would provide, would come knocking, would check on the old woman who'd opened her door once when it mattered. The storm lasted 3 days. On the second night, Barb heard movement outside. Not knocking this time, just presence. Large bodies moving slow around the cabin, checking walls, making sure everything held, making sure she was safe. She went to the window, pressed her hand against the cold glass, whispered thank you into the darkness. The movement stopped. For a long moment, nothing. Then she saw it, a handprint appearing on the outside of the glass. Massive, too large to be human, pressed against the window right where her own hand rested, palm to palm with only glass between them. Barb's eyes filled. The tears came hot and fast. She kept her hand there, matching the outline on the other side, feeling, despite the cold and glass and impossible distance, something like connection. The handprint stayed for maybe 5 seconds. Then it pulled away. The presence outside moved off. By the time Barb wiped her eyes and looked again, there was nothing but storm and darkness. But the print remained on the glass. Frost crystals holding the shape, evidence that couldn't be denied. She left it there. Didn't wipe it away. Let it fade naturally over the coming days as the sun returned and temperatures rose. Spring came again. The cabin leaked worse this year. Barb patched what she could, but age was catching up to the place the same way it was catching up to her. The roof needed work. The foundation had cracks. The porch steps sagged. She couldn't fix it all herself. Not anymore. Her body wouldn't let her. The boys called more often now. They'd coordinated somehow, developed a schedule. One called Mondays, the other Thursdays. Asked the same questions. How was she eating? Was she taking her medications? Had she thought more about moving, she gave the same answers. She was fine. Yes, she took her pills. No, she wasn't ready to leave. But the truth was more complicated. Some mornings she woke and couldn't remember why she'd walked into a room, found herself staring at cabinets with no idea what she'd been looking for. Her hands shook when she tried to write. The words came slower now, thoughts tangling before they reached her mouth. Time was running out. She could feel it, the way you feel weather changing in your bones. Summer peaked and faded. Autumn returned with its gold and red farewells. Barb sat on her porch more that year, watching the meadow, the forest, waiting for movement that came less frequently now. Maybe they'd moved on, found somewhere safer, deeper. Maybe the child was grown, didn't need checking on the old woman anymore. Maybe the mother had died, and the child didn't remember the cabin, or the 5 days, or the woman who'd given shelter when there was nowhere else to go. Barb tried not to mind, tried to be grateful for what she'd had, but loneliness crept back in, heavier than before. The cabin felt empty in a way it hadn't even after Tom died. She'd been needed once, known what it felt like to matter again, and then it had ended, the way everything does. October came, then November, the first snow. Barb's body was giving up. She knew it, could feel it in how her heart stuttered sometimes, how her breath came short after even small exertion. The doctor in Whitefish had said words like cardiac and diminished capacity and suggested she not spend winter alone. She'd nodded, agreed to think about it, then driven home and done nothing. Because how could she leave? What if they came back? What if they needed her and she was gone? The cabin empty, another closed door in a world full of them. The storm that year came in mid-November, earlier than usual, fiercer. The radio called it the worst in 40 years before the power went out. Barb sat by her fire, watching it build. Snow piled against the windows. Wind hammered the walls. The cabin shook with each gust, and she wondered if this was how it ended. The roof giving way, the cold getting in, her body just stopping in the chair where Tom used to sit. She wasn't afraid. Tired, maybe. Ready, but not afraid. The knock came around midnight. Barb was half asleep, drifting in that space between waking and dreaming. The sound pulled her back. 3 strikes, heavy, deliberate. She stood. Her legs protested, joints grinding. Took her longer to reach the door this time. Everything took longer now. She pulled it open. The mother stood there, older now, her fur grayer, her eyes deeper. The child, not a child anymore, nearly as tall as its mother, stood beside her, both covered in snow, both breathing hard. But they weren't alone. Behind them, Barb saw others. 3 more, younger, a family, maybe, or a group that had banded together for survival. They hung back at the tree line, watching, cautious. The mother looked at Barb. In her eyes, Barb saw everything that needed saying. The old woman was dying. The cabin was failing. Winter was here, and it had teeth. But the mother had come anyway. Come to return what had been given. Shelter for shelter, life for life. Barb understood. She stepped back, opened the door wide. "Come in," she said. Her voice was weak, raspy. "All of you, come in from the cold." The mother entered first, the nearly grown child beside her. Then the others, cautious, watching Barb, like she might change her mind. They filled the cabin, made it smaller and warmer, and alive in a way it hadn't been since those 5 days years ago. Barb closed the door. The storm raged outside. Inside, she was surrounded by breathing that wasn't her own, by presence, by the particular warmth of bodies sharing space. She moved to build up the fire, but the mother stopped her. Gentle, took the logs from her hands, built the fire herself, while the others settled around the room. The nearly grown child came close, looked at Barb with Tom's eyes. No, with its mother's eyes, the same ones that had pleaded for help years ago. It touched her hand, just briefly. A brush of fur against skin that felt like gratitude and farewell all at once. Barb's legs gave out. She sat hard in Tom's chair. The room spun slightly. Her chest hurt in a way that felt final. The end pushing close now, but she wasn't alone. The cabin was full. The mother knelt beside her chair, watching with those deep, aware eyes. The others filled the spaces around the room, their presence holding the cold at bay. "Thank you," Barb whispered, "for coming back, for checking on me, for remembering." The mother made a sound, low, gentle, like a lullaby or a prayer. Barb's eyes grew heavy. The fire danced in her vision, warm and golden. She felt hands massive. "Ferd, take hers. Hold them. Keep them warm." "Outside," the storm screamed. Inside, the cabin held. Not empty anymore, not lonely, just filled with breathing and warmth and the knowledge that she'd mattered. That she'd opened a door when it counted. That she'd been seen. Her eyes closed. The darkness that came wasn't frightening. It felt like sleep, like rest after years of waiting, like finally being allowed to stop. The mother held her hands until they went cold, until Barb's breathing stopped, and the old woman slipped away in her chair, the same chair where her husband used to sit, the same chair where she'd watched over a mother and child years ago when winter tried to kill them. Then the mother stood, looked at the others. They understood. Carefully, with a gentleness that contradicted their size, they lifted Barb from the chair, wrapped her in the same wool blankets she'd given them years before, carried her out into the storm. The forest took her, not cruelly, with reverence. They brought her deep into the woods, to a place where the snow fell softer, where the trees grew ancient and protective. They laid her down with care, covered her with pine boughs and snow, made her part of the forest, the way the forest had been part of her. Then they returned to the cabin. The mother stoked the fire high. They stayed through the storm, keeping the cabin warm, keeping it alive. When the storm broke 3 days later, they left, closed the door behind them, walked back into the forest where they belonged. The Forest Service found the cabin a week later, door unlocked, fire burned down to ash, no sign of Barbara Walsh inside. They searched the woods, found nothing, no body, no tracks, no evidence of where she'd gone or what had happened. She'd simply vanished during the storm. Her boys came, packed up the cabin, found 2 extra mugs, always kept clean by the sink, found blankets that didn't belong to their mother, found food set out on the porch like offerings, found on the window a faint outline in the glass that looked almost like a handprint, too large to be human. They didn't know what to make of any of it, chalked it up to their mother's eccentricities in old age. Sold the cabin to a developer who planned to tear it down and build something modern. But before the dozers came, before the cabin was reduced to splinters and memory, people started seeing things in the woods, large shapes moving between trees. Families, some said, mothers with young. They never came close, never threatened, just watched from the shadows like they were keeping vigil over something. The developer's equipment started breaking down, engines that wouldn't start, tires slashed clean through. No one saw anything, but the crew got nervous, refused to work. Eventually the deal fell apart, and the cabin stood abandoned. It still stands there now, 12 miles outside Whitefish, doors unlocked, windows intact, the forest pressing close on all sides. Sometimes, hikers passing through report seeing smoke from the chimney on winter nights. But when they check, the cabin is empty. Cold, no fire in the hearth, no sign anyone has been there in years. Others claim to see figures moving around the property, large, careful, like they're tending something, maintaining it, keeping watch. The Forest Service doesn't investigate anymore, can't explain it anyway, just mark the area on their maps with a notation that gets ignored, leave undisturbed. And deep in the woods, where snow falls soft and trees grow ancient, there's a place locals don't go. A clearing where nothing disturbs the ground, where pine boughs stay green year-round, and the earth feels warmer than it should. Some say it's sacred ground. Others say it's just forest. But those who've seen the shapes moving between trees, Those who've watched the cabins smoke on winter nights, they know different. They know some debts get repaid, some kindness gets remembered. Some doors, once opened, can never fully close. And in the deepest part of winter, when storms rage through Montana mountains, if you listen close enough through the wind, you might hear it. Not quite human, not quite animal, something in between. The sound of mothers calling through darkness, checking, remembering, making sure no one freezes alone. The cabin waits, the forest watches, and somewhere in the space between what is and what shouldn't be, an old woman rests under snow and pine, wrapped in wool blankets, held by the same hands she once sheltered. The woods don't forgive easily, but they remember. And memory, in the end, is its own kind of shelter. The story is so interesting, right? It has touched your heart. Comment what you like below. Let's go to story 2 today. Would you break every rule you ever followed to save something the world says doesn't exist? Comment yes or no. Frank Novak had to make that choice in the deep snow of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Here's what happened. The cold that winter had a memory. It remembered every house it had ever entered, everybody it had ever broken down, and it came back each night with the patience of something that knew it would outlast you. Frank Novak's cabin sat at the edge of the Huron Mountains like a bad tooth nobody bothered to pull. The roof sagged where the snow piled too deep. The north wall had frost growing on the inside, delicate as lace, beautiful in the way things are when they're slowly killing you. He was 67 years old. His hands didn't work the way they used to. The arthritis had settled in his knuckles, like rust in old machinery, grinding and catching every time he tried to make a fist. Some mornings, he couldn't open the jar of instant coffee. Those mornings, he just sat at the table and stared at it until he got angry enough to try again. The cabin smelled like wet wool and diesel fuel, and the particular loneliness of a man who'd stopped expecting company. There were still 2 coffee mugs in the cabinet. He used the same one every day. The other sat there gathering dust, a chip on the rim, blue ceramic with faded flowers. Linda's mug, 3 years dead, and he still couldn't throw it out. Couldn't use it either. Some things you keep, because letting go feels like betraying the dead. On the wall above the wood stove hung a photograph in a frame he'd made himself back when his hands still worked right. Linda holding their daughter Katie at the beach, Ludington, summer of '79. Katie was 5, gap-toothed, squinting at the camera like the sun had personally insulted her. Linda's hair was dark then, pulled back in a ponytail, her smile the kind that made you believe good things were possible. Katie died in '84. Drunk driver, County Road outside Marquette, 16 years old. Frank had been at the plant when the sheriff came. Third shift, building transmissions. They pulled him off the line and he knew before they said a word. You always know. Linda held on until 92. Cancer started in her lungs, spread everywhere else. Died at home, in their bed, holding his hand. Last thing she said was take care of yourself. He'd lied and said he would. The plant closed in '93. GM decided Michigan workers cost too much. Moved the whole operation to Mexico. 42 years Frank gave them. Started when he was 19, straight out of high school. Worked the line, then quality control, then union safety inspector. Knew every bolt, every weld, every shortcut management tried to slip past the regulators. He'd fought them hard. Won some, lost more. In the end, it didn't matter. They closed anyway. His pension was supposed to be enough. Then they restructured, cut it by 30%. Now he lived on that, and Social Security, in a cabin his father built in '58, 20 miles from the nearest town. The truck was a '87 Chevy, rusting out from underneath, burning oil. He drove it once a week to Ishpeming for supplies. Groceries, cigarettes, cheap whiskey. Talked to the cashier at the IGA, maybe 3 minutes total. That was his week. Some nights, he sat at the table with the bottle and the photograph and tried to remember what Linda's voice sounded like. It was getting harder. Memory was a rotary phone dial carefully. Wait, hope nobody's on the line. More and more, he got nothing but static. Other nights, he played the tape. Katie had made it for him in '83, right before she died. Called it Dad's Driving Songs. Recorded it off the radio on a boombox, complete with her narration between tracks. Okay, Dad, this one's for when you're stuck in traffic and need to not be mad. Then Born to Run would kick in, Springsteen's voice rough and young and full of the kind of hope Frank couldn't remember feeling. The tape lived in the glove box of his truck for decades. By the time he dug it out, the plastic casing was cracked. The label faded to nothing, but it still played. The tape deck in his truck was the only one he owned. So sometimes, late at night, when the silence got too heavy, he'd bundle up and sit in the cab in the driveway, engine off, heater dead, breath fogging the windshield, and listen to his dead daughter's voice, introducing songs she'd loved 30 years ago. He never made it past track 3. December '95 came in mean. Snow fell for 2 weeks straight. The kind that doesn't melt, just piles and compacts and weights. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 12 below. Inside, with the stove cranking, it hovered around 50. Frank wore 2 sweaters and Linda's old wool coat. It still smelled like her, faintly, under the smoke and sweat. He wore it every day. The woods pressed close, birch and pine and hemlock, thick and dark, older than the country. In summer you could see maybe 30 yards into the trees. In winter, with the snow and the bare branches, maybe 50, but it didn't matter. The forest had its own silence. This silence listened. It waited. It had been here long before and would be here long after. Frank knew these woods, hunted them as a kid, knew the trails, the ridgelines, the places where the deer bedded down, but he hadn't been out there in years. His knees were shot. His lungs weren't much better. 42 years breathing metal dust and paint fumes. The doctor said emphysema, said take it easy, said 5 years maybe if he quit smoking. He didn't quit. The night it happened, Frank was sitting by the stove with a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The wind outside wasn't wind anymore. It had weight. It pressed against the walls, like something trying to find a way in. The cabin creaked and settled, old wood talking to itself. Then he heard it. Not the wind, not the trees. Something else. A sound like weight shifting on the porch. A thump, low and heavy. The kind of sound a body makes when it's got nothing left. Frank set the mug down. Listened. Another thump. This one scraped, dragged. He stood slow, knees popping, and moved to the door. The shotgun was in the corner, but he didn't reach for it. Didn't know why. Just didn't. He turned the knob and pulled. The cold hit him first, a wall of it, sharp enough to take his breath. Then he saw a shape, huge, collapsed against the railing, breath coming in shallow clouds, blood on the snow, dark and thick, pooling under its shoulder, fur matted with ice and mud, face hidden, chest rising and falling too slow. And behind it, pressed against the wall of the cabin, 2 smaller shapes, young, trembling, eyes wide and dark, and fixed on him with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope. They didn't move, didn't growl, didn't run. They just looked at him. Frank stood there, one hand on the door frame, the cold pouring past him into the cabin. He should have been scared, should have slammed the door, grabbed the shotgun, called who? The sheriff, and say what? But he wasn't scared. He was something else, something older. He stepped back, opened the door wider, didn't say anything. What would he say? The little ones didn't move at first. Then the smaller of the 2, gangly and thin, crept forward, touched the big one's arm. A sound came from its throat, soft, almost like a hum. The other one joined, and together they got under her because it was a her, Frank could tell now, and dragged her forward, inch by inch, across the threshold and into the cabin. Frank stepped aside, let them. The heat from the stove hit them all at once. Steam rose from their fur. The smell was overwhelming earth, and blood, and something wild, something that had never been inside walls before. They laid her down near the stove, careful, almost gentle. One of them stayed close, the other looked around, eyes moving fast, taking in the room, the shadows, the narrow space. It saw the photograph on the wall and stopped, stared at it. Frank saw its head tilt, just slightly, the way a dog does when it hears something it can't quite place. Then it looked back at him. Frank moved slow, grabbed the old army blanket from the chair, green wool, scratchy, standard issue, from his brief stint in the guard back in '76, and laid it out near the stove. The little ones understood. They shifted her onto it, adjusting her arms, her head, like they'd done this before. The mother didn't open her eyes. Her breathing was thin, ragged. The blood was coming from her shoulder, a gash deep enough to see bone. Frank had seen wounds like that. Factory accidents, guys getting caught in machinery. You don't forget. He went to the sink, filled a bowl with warm water from the kettle, found a clean rag under the counter, brought it over, set it down next to her. The little ones watched him. He nodded at the bowl. One of them reached out, dipped a hand in, pulled back fast when the water was too hot. Frank adjusted it, added cold. Tried again. This time it worked. He stepped back, let them tend to her. Outside the wind howled, inside the stove crackled, and the shadows moved slow across the walls. Frank went to the cabinet, pulled out the tin of powdered milk, a jar of jerky, 2 apples going soft. Set them on the table. The little ones didn't move toward the food, but their eyes followed it. Frank sat down in his chair, not too close, not too far. Just Saturday watched. One of the little ones, the bigger of the 2, looked at him again. It had Linda's eyes. Not the color, not the shape, but the way they looked at you, like they saw past the surface, like they knew. Frank looked away first. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Frank added wood, poked at the coals, kept the heat steady. The mother's breathing evened out. Not strong, but better. The little ones curled up next to her, one on each side, their long arms draped across her chest, like they were afraid she'd disappear if they let go. Frank dozed. The chair creaked under his weight. Outside the wind eased, the storm moving east, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. When he woke, it was still dark. The fire had died down to embers. One of the little ones was standing by the door, looking out the window, breath fogging the glass. The other was awake too, sitting up, watching Frank. He didn't move, just met its gaze. It didn't look away. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked under the weight of snow. The sound echoed through the trees like a warning. The little one by the window turned, made a low sound. The other stood. Together they moved to the door, looked back at the mother, then at Frank. He understood. He stood, wincing as his knees protested, and opened the door just enough to see out. The snow had stopped. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like someone had thrown them. The cold was different now, still brutal, but clean. And out there, at the edge of the clearing, shapes moved. 3 of them, big, watching. Frank's heart kicked hard against his ribs. The little ones stepped outside, didn't run, just walked slow, deliberate, out into the snow. The shapes at the tree line shifted, and Frank realized they'd been waiting to see if the little ones were safe. One of the shapes moved forward, not threatening, just closer. It stopped maybe 20 yards out, and Frank saw it clear. Taller than any man, broader, covered in fur dark, as the trees behind it. It raised one hand, not waving, just acknowledging. Frank raised his hand back. They stood there, man and creature, in the frozen silence of a Michigan winter, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Then the shapes melted back into the trees, and the little ones turned and came back inside. Frank closed the door. The mother was awake, her eyes open, dark and deep, watching him. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. Frank sat back down in his chair. "Guess you're staying," he said. Nobody answered. The days that followed had their own rhythm. The mother healed slow. The wound on her shoulder closed. The color returned to her face, or what Frank thought of as her face. The little ones stayed close, venturing outside only to bring back branches, bark, things Frank didn't recognize. They didn't eat the food he set out, not at first, but on the third day, the smaller one took an apple, held it, turned it over in its hands, then bit into it carefully, like it wasn't sure what would happen. The sound it made somewhere between surprise and pleasure almost made Frank smile. By the end of the week, they were eating regularly, not much, and not always the same things, but enough. The jerky they left alone, the apples they loved, the powdered milk they drank straight from the tin when they thought Frank wasn't looking. They didn't talk. Frank didn't expect them to, but they communicated. Sounds, gestures, the tilt of a head, the way they touched each other's arms. It was language, just not his. Frank watched them the way he used to watch the assembly line, looking for patterns, rhythms, the places where things fit together. He'd been good at that job, real good. Spent years as a safety inspector, walking the floor, checking wells, watching for the places where management cut corners. He'd filed reports, flagged violations, pushed back when they tried to rush, saved lives, probably. Though nobody ever said thank you. But there were times he didn't push. Times the foreman came to him, said the schedule's tight. Frank, we need to keep moving, just this once. And Frank, tired, wanting to keep the peace, signed off on things he shouldn't have. 3 guys died in '89. Hydraulic press malfunction. Frank had flagged that press 2 months earlier. Foreman said they'd fix it. They didn't. The press failed, the safety cage didn't engage, and 3 men went home in pieces. Frank's report was clean. He'd done his job. Filed the paperwork. It wasn't his fault the foreman ignored it, but he knew. He knew, and he didn't push harder. Didn't go over the foreman's head, didn't raise hell, didn't make them shut the line down. He kept his head down, kept working, kept quiet. Casey deed in 84, Toesman deed in 89. Different accidents, different causes, but the feeling was the same. Frank looked at the mother now, lying by his stove, healing in his cabin, protected by walls he'd let become weak because he'd stopped caring whether they held. She was protecting her young, doing what he hadn't. He stood, joints cracking, and walked to the window. The woods were still. The snow lay thick and untouched, but he knew they were out there, watching, waiting. He'd spent 40 years building cars, 40 years trying to keep people safe. Failed more than he succeeded. Maybe this was a chance to do it right. The mother stood for the first time on day 8, shaky, leaning against the wall, but standing. The little ones stayed close, hands hovering near her like they expected her to fall. She didn't. She took a step, then another, then stopped and looked at Frank. He nodded. She nodded back. That night, Frank heard them leave. Didn't see it, just heard the door open, felt the cold rush in, then the door close again. He got up, looked out the window. They were gone. He sat back down, feeling the emptiness of the cabin settle around him, poured a drink, stared at the photograph on the wall. 3 days passed. He didn't see them, didn't expect to. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, he found something on the porch. A bundle of evergreen branches, tied together with what looked like dried grass. In the center, tucked carefully, a stone, smooth, river-worn, with a small hole worn through the middle like a natural eye. Frank picked it up, turned it over in his arthritic hands. The stone was warm. He looked at the woods. Nothing moved, but he felt them, watching. He set the stone on the windowsill, next to the photograph. Winter deepened. January came in hard, colder than December, meaner. The radio said it was the coldest winter in 50 years. Frank believed it. The frost on the inside walls grew thicker. The stove ran all day and all night, and still the cabin never got warm. He saw them sometimes, not close. Just shapes moving through the trees at dusk, shadows that didn't move like deer. Once he saw one standing on the ridge above the cabin, silhouetted against the sky, watching. He waved. It didn't wave back, just stood there, then turned and disappeared into the white. Frank started leaving food out. Nothing fancy. Apples, bread, jerky. He wouldn't eat anyway. He set it on a flat rock at the edge of the clearing. Every morning it was gone. He didn't know if they took it or if the crows did. Didn't matter. Then one morning he found tracks. Big ones, leading from the woods to the rock, then back. In the snow next to the tracks, pressed deliberately into the powder, a handprint. Too large to be human, fingers too long. Frank knelt down, his breath fogging in the cold, and placed his own hand next to it. His hand looked like a child's in comparison. He stayed there a long time, kneeling in the snow, feeling the cold seep through his jeans, into his bones. Somewhere in the trees, a crow called. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and ice, and something else. Something old. Frank closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. To who? He didn't know. Katie, Linda, the men at the plant, himself, maybe all of them. When he opened his eyes, one of the little ones was standing at the edge of the clearing, just standing, watching him. Frank didn't move, didn't speak. The little one took a step forward, then another, slowly, carefully, like approaching something fragile. It stopped 10 feet away, looked at him, really looked, the way you look at something you're trying to understand. Frank stayed kneeling, hands in the snow, breath clouding. The little one reached into the fur at its chest and pulled something out, held it out. A feather, long, barred with brown and white. Hawk, maybe, or owl. Frank held out his hand. The little one stepped forward, placed the feather in Frank's palm, then stepped back. It turned and walked back to the trees, glancing over its shoulder once before disappearing into the shadows. Frank looked at the feather. Light as nothing. Perfect. He stood slow, knees screaming, and walked back to the cabin. Placed the feather on the windowsill next to the stone and the photograph. 3 things now. 3 things that said you're not alone. February came, and with it, trouble. Frank heard the trucks before he saw them. 2 of them, diesel engines growling up the old logging road, moving slow through the deep snow. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, watching them approach. They stopped in his driveway. 4 men climbed out. Hunting gear, rifles, the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. The one in front was tall, heavy guts spilling over his belt, face red from cold and something else. He walked up to the porch like he owned it. "You Novak." "Yeah, name's Trask. This is my land you're on." Frank stared at him. "No, it's not. Hell, it isn't. My family's owned this property since the 42nds. Your family sold it in 58. To my father. I got the deed inside if you need to see it." Trask's face got redder. "Doesn't matter. We got permission to hunt here." "From who?" "Don't need it from you, old man. Now, we're looking for something. Been tracks all over these woods. Big ones. You seen anything strange?" Frank kept his face blank. "Strange? How?" "Don't play stupid. You know what we're talking about. Things been hitting game cameras all winter. We got photos. Video. Goddamn thing's real. And we're gonna bring it in." "Bring it in?" "That's right. Dead or alive, don't matter. There's money in this. Real money. You help us out, we'll cut you in." Frank looked past Trask at the other men. They had the look, the hunger, the kind that doesn't care what it breaks as long as it gets what it wants. "Nothing strange out here," Frank said. "Just trees and snow. Bullshit. You're sitting right in the middle of it. Things probably watching us right now." Frank shrugged. "Then you don't need my help." Trask stepped closer. "Listen, old man. You can help us, or you can stay out of the way. But either way, we're hunting here. You got a problem with that? Call the sheriff. See if he cares." He turned and walked back to the trucks. The other men followed. Engines started, trucks turned around, headed back down the road. Frank stood there until the sound faded. Then he went inside, grabbed his coat, and headed into the woods. He found them 2 miles in, near the old beaver pond. The mother and the 2 little ones, standing in a small clearing, watching him approach. They didn't run. They'd been waiting. Frank stopped 20 feet away, breath ragged, legs trembling. Too old for this. Too broken. "There's men," he said, "coming for you, hunters." The mother tilted her head, listening. "You need to go. Deeper. Higher. Somewhere they can't follow." She didn't move. "I'm serious. They got guns. They got radios. They're not gonna stop." The mother took a step forward, then another. She stopped right in front of him, so close he could feel the heat coming off her body, could smell the earth and pine in her fur. She reached out one hand, placed it on his chest, right over his heart. Frank's breath caught. She held it there, steady, warm. Then she turned and walked back to the little ones. They followed her into the trees, moving fast, melting into the shadows. Frank stood there, hand over the spot where she'd touched him. It was still warm. He walked back to the cabin as the sun started to set. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but his chest, where she'd touched him, still felt warm. Inside, he poured a drink, sat down, looked at the photograph on the wall. Katie smiled back at him, gap-toothed, and 5 years old and gone. Frank picked up the feather from the windowsill, turned it over in his hands. "I'm not letting them get hurt," he said. The photograph didn't answer. Outside, in the darkness beyond the window, something moved. Frank saw it, just a shape, tall and still, standing at the tree line. Watching, he raised the glass. The shape raised one hand, then it was gone. Frank drank, set the glass down, and stood. He walked to the closet, pulled out the old hunting rifle. Hadn't fired it in 10 years. Probably didn't even work, but he cleaned it anyway, loaded it, set it by the door. Then he went to bed. Sleep didn't come easy. When it did, he dreamed of the plant, the hydraulic press, the sound it made when it failed, the screaming. He woke in the dark, heart pounding, sheets soaked with sweat. Somewhere outside, far away, something howled. Not a wolf, not a coyote, something else. Frank lay there, listening, until the sound faded and the woods went quiet again. Morning came slow. Frank made coffee, stood at the window, watched the trees. They were out there. He knew it. The hunters would be back. He knew that too. The question was what he was going to do about it. He looked at the photograph, then at the feather, then at the stone, with the hole worn through its center. 3 things. 3 chances he hadn't deserved. He picked up the rifle. "All right," he said to the empty room. "Let's see if I can get this right." He walked out into the snow, into the trees, following tracks that didn't belong to anything that was supposed to exist. Behind him, the cabin sat quiet and cold, smoke rising thin from the chimney, the door left open just a crack. In the woods, the mother watched him coming, the little ones at her side. She didn't run. She waited. Frank stopped 10 feet away, rifle in his hands, breath clouding the air. "I'm not letting them hurt you," he said. The mother looked at the rifle, then at him. Frank lowered it, set it in the snow. "I mean it," he said. "I'm done standing by." The little ones looked at each other, then at their mother. She took a step forward, then another. And Frank Novak, 67 years old, broken and tired, and full of regrets he'd never shake, stood his ground. The mother reached out, placed both hands on his shoulders, looked him in the eyes, and Frank understood. This wasn't about him. It was never about him. It was about what you do when you're given a second chance. When the world hands you something fragile and says, "Protect this," do you turn away? Or do you finally, after all the failures, all the times you stayed quiet, all the moments you chose safety over what was right, do you stand? The mother let go, stepped back, turned to the little ones, and made a low sound, almost like a hum. They moved together, deeper into the trees, toward the ridge, toward the high country where the snow stayed all year, and men didn't follow. Frank watched them go. Then he picked up the rifle, turned, and walked back to the cabin. He had work to do. The hunters came back that afternoon. 3 trucks this time. 8 men. Frank was waiting on the porch. Trask climbed out first, rifle in hand. "You're still here. It's my land. Told you we're hunting here. You can't stop us." "I know." Trask paused. "So you're just gonna stand there?" "Yep." "The hell's wrong with you, old man? There's money in this. Real money. Life-changing money." Frank looked at him. Looked at the other men. Looked at the rifles, the gear, the trucks, the hunger. "Sometimes," Frank said, "money ain't what matters." Trask laughed. "That's what poor people say." "Maybe. So you're really not gonna help?" "No. You're gonna stand in our way?" "If I have to." Trask stepped closer. "You threatening me?" "No. Just telling you how it is." One of the other men spoke up. "Forget him. Let's just go." Trask stared at Frank for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Fine. Stay out of our way." They headed into the woods, moving fast, spreading out. Frank watched them go. Then he walked inside, grabbed his coat and the rifle, and followed. He knew these woods, knew them better than they did. Knew the trails, the hollows, the places where the land got tricky. Knew where someone who didn't belong could get lost. Or hurt. Or worse. He moved slow, staying just far enough back that they didn't see him. Listening to their radios, their voices echoing through the trees. They were heading north, toward the ridge, toward where he'd sent the mother and the little ones. Frank's chest tightened. His breath came harder. He pushed through, ignoring the pain in his knees, the burning in his lungs. He had to get there first. The trees closed in. The snow got deeper. The men's voices faded behind him, and Frank realized he was alone now, truly alone. No voices, no footsteps, just the sound of his own breath and the creak of branches under the weight of snow. He stopped, listened. Ahead, through the trees, he saw movement. Them, the mother standing at the base of the ridge, the little ones behind her, watching him. Frank walked forward, slow, deliberate, stopped 20 feet away. "They're coming," he said. "You need to go. Now." The mother didn't move. "Please," Frank said. "I can't." He stopped, couldn't finish. The mother looked at him, really looked. Then she did something Frank didn't expect. She walked to the edge of the clearing, bent down, picked up something from the snow, a trap. Steel jaws, rusted but still deadly, hidden under a thin layer of powder. She held it up, showed it to him. Then she crushed it. Just closed her hand and the metal bent like paper. She dropped it, moved to another spot, found another trap, crushed that one too. Frank understood. She'd been doing this all winter, disarming traps, protecting her young, keeping them safe in a world that wanted them dead. She looked at him again, and Frank knew what she was saying. You can't stop them, but you can slow them down. Behind him, voices, getting closer. Frank turned, saw the first of the hunters emerge from the trees, rifle up, scanning. He saw the mother. His eyes went wide. "There," he shouted. "I got it. I see it." The others came running. Frank stepped between them and the mother. "Move," Trask said. "No." I said move, old man. "No." Trask raised the rifle. "I will drop you." Frank stood there, arms at his sides, rifle on the ground. He looked at Trask, looked at the other men, saw the hunger, the greed, the absolute certainty that they were right and he was wrong. "You know what I did for 40 years, Frank said. "I built cars, good cars, safe cars, worked quality control, safety inspector. Whole job was making sure people didn't get hurt. The hell's that got to do with anything? I was good at it, real good, saved lives. But sometimes I didn't push hard enough. Sometimes I let things slide. Guys died because I didn't speak up when I should have. So what? So I'm speaking up now. Get out of the way." "No." Trask's finger moved to the trigger, and behind Frank, the mother moved. She didn't attack, didn't charge, just took one step forward, then another, until she was standing right behind Frank, close enough to touch. The little ones followed, stood on either side of her. 3 of them, one of him, 8 hunters with rifles, facing 4 beings who shouldn't exist. The woods went silent. Trask stared. The other men stared. Nobody moved. Then, from somewhere deep in the trees, a sound, low, resonant, echoing through the forest like a drumbeat. Another answered from the north, then another from the west. The hunters looked around, rifles swinging. "What the hell is that?" one of them whispered. More sounds. Closer now. Shapes moving through the trees, tall and dark, circling. "There's more," another hunter said, voice shaking. "Jesus Christ, there's more." The mother raised one hand. The sounds stopped. The shapes stopped. Everything stopped. She looked at Trask. Didn't make a sound, just looked. Trask lowered his rifle, hands shaking. "We're leaving." "Good idea," Frank said. They backed away, slowly at first, then faster, turning and running once they hit the trail. The sounds of their retreat echoed through the woods, breaking branches, shouted curses, engines starting, then silence. Frank stood there, legs trembling, heart hammering. The mother stepped forward, placed one hand on his shoulder. He felt that warmth again, that presence. "Go," he said quietly, "before they come back." She nodded, turned. The little ones followed. They moved up the ridge, fast and silent, and within moments, they were gone. Frank stood alone in the clearing, snow falling soft around him, and realized he was crying. Not from fear, not from relief, from something else. Something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. He'd done it. Finally, after all the failures, all the times he stayed quiet, all the moments he chose wrong, he'd stood up. He walked back to the cabin as the sun set, turning the snow orange and pink. Inside, he poured a drink, looked at the photograph on the wall. "I did it, Katie," he said. "I finally did it." The photograph didn't answer, but he felt something shift, like a weight lifting, like forgiveness. He picked up the cassette tape from the table, his daughter's voice, frozen in plastic and magnetic ribbon, waiting. He put on his coat, walked out to the truck, climbed in. The engine turned over after 3 tries. He put the tape in the deck. Static. Then Katie's voice, young and bright and gone. "Okay, Dad, this one's for when you need to remember something good." The music started. Thunder Road. Springsteen, young and hungry and alive. Frank sat there in the cold cab, breath fogging the windshield, listening to his dead daughter's voice and watching the woods. In the trees, at the edge of the clearing, a shape stood, watching. Frank raised his hand. The shape raised its hand back. Then the music swelled, and Frank closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt warm. The tape played through, then again. By the 3rd time, the stars were out, hard and bright in the frozen sky. Frank's breath had frosted the inside of the windshield until he could barely see out. He didn't care. He sat there until his fingers went numb, until the cold found its way through Linda's coat and settled in his chest like it was coming home. When he finally climbed out, his legs nearly gave. He caught himself on the door, stood there a moment, breathing hard. The shape in the trees was gone, but he felt them out there, watching, waiting. He went inside. The cabin was cold. He'd let the fire die. He built it back up, slow and careful, hands shaking from more than just the temperature. Once the flames caught, he sat in his chair and stared at nothing. Sleep came and went in pieces. Dreams of Katie, dreams of Linda, dreams of the plant, the press. The moment everything went wrong, in the dreams he tried to scream, tried to warn them, but his voice wouldn't work. It never worked. He woke before dawn, the fire down to coals again, his body stiff and aching. Outside the window, the world was blue-gray, that hour before sunrise, when nothing seems quite real. There was something on the porch. Frank stood, joints popping, and walked to the door, opened it slow. A bundle, larger than before. Evergreen branches woven together with bark and dried grass. The craftsmanship delicate, purposeful. In the center, 3 stones, smooth river stones, each with a hole worn through the middle, placed in a line, smallest to largest, and beneath them, pressed into the wood of the porch, still fresh enough to see clearly, 3 handprints. Mother. Too young. Frank knelt down, ignoring the pain, and placed his hand next to the smallest print. It was still warm. They'd been here. While he slept, while he dreamed, they'd come right up to his door and left this. He picked up the bundle carefully, brought it inside, set it on the table next to the photograph. The stones caught the early light, 3 small windows to somewhere else. Frank made coffee, stood at the stove while the pot percolated, steam rising in the cold air. His hands were worse today, barely managed to get the lid on the pot. The arthritis was winning. Some battles you don't. He poured a cup, sat down, looked at the bundle. 3 stones. Mother, too young, and him. Where was his stone? The question sat in his chest like something living. The radio crackled to life on the shelf he'd left it on. Habit from years of checking the weather before the drive to work. The announcer's voice was cheerful, that forced morning brightness that made Frank's teeth hurt. Record lows continuing through the weekend. State Highway Patrol advising against unnecessary travel. In local news, a group of hunters reported strange activity in the Huron Mountains yesterday. Claiming to have encountered, Frank turned it off. He didn't need to hear it. Didn't need to know what they were saying, what story they were spinning. It didn't matter. What mattered was they'd run. When it came down to it, when faced with something bigger than their greed, they'd turned and run. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all you could ask. He finished his coffee, put on his coat, grabbed the rifle not to use, just to have, and walked out into the morning. The snow had a crust now, frozen overnight, crunching under his boots. He walked the same path he'd walked the day before, following the tracks that were already filling in with blown snow. The woods were quiet, not empty, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when something's listening. He found the clearing where he'd stood between the hunters and the mother. The trampled snow, the crushed traps scattered like broken bones. He knelt down, picked up one of the twisted pieces of metal, solid steel, jaws that could snap a leg in half, bent like it was made of foil. He set it down, kept walking. The ridge rose ahead of him, steep and rocky, the kind of terrain that had always been hard. Now, at 67 with bad knees and worse lungs, it was nearly impossible. He climbed anyway. One step, then another, hands grabbing branches, boots slipping on ice, breath coming in short gasps that burned. Halfway up, he had to stop. Leaned against a tree, chest heaving, vision swimming. The doctor's voice echoed in his head. 5 years, maybe. If you're lucky. Doesn't feel lucky, Frank muttered. He kept climbing. At the top, the world opened up. The ridgeline ran east to west, pine and hemlock thick on both sides. The valley below hidden in morning shadow. From here you could see for miles. On a clear day, you could see Lake Superior, a gray line on the horizon. Today, with the clouds low and heavy, you could barely see past the next ridge, but you could see the tracks. Leading north, deep in the snow, 3 sets. 1 large, 2 smaller. Frank followed them. The wind picked up as he walked the ridge, cutting through his coat, finding every gap, every weakness. His fingers went numb. His face felt like carved wood. But he kept walking, following those tracks, needing to know where they led. He walked for an hour, maybe 2. Time got strange up here. The cold, and the silence doing something to your sense of it. The tracks led him through thick stands of pine, across small clearings, around boulder fields that looked like they'd been there since before people. Then the tracks stopped. Frank stood there, breathing hard, looking at the snow. The prints just ended, like they'd stepped off the earth into somewhere else. He turned in a slow circle. Nothing. No cave, no overhang, no place they could have gone. Just trees and snow and rock and sky. "Where'd you go?" he said to the empty air. No answer. Just the wind. Frank stood there a long time, feeling the cold work its way deeper, feeling his body start to shut down the way bodies do when they've had enough. He should turn back, should get down off this ridge before he couldn't, before his legs gave out, before the cold took him, before he saw it. Not them, not the mother or the young. Something else. A tree. Old. So old it made the others look like children. Trunk wide as a truck, bark thick and scarred, branches reaching up into the grey sky like hands. And at the base, in the roots, a hollow, large enough to crawl into, large enough to hide in. Frank walked to it, knelt down. The opening was dark, but not empty. Inside, he could see shapes, arrangements, stones in patterns, feathers hanging from strings of bark, bones, small and white, laid out carefully. A shrine. No, not a shrine, a home. This was where they came. This was where they'd always come, for generations, maybe, for centuries. This tree had stood here before the country existed, before the state, before the town, before men came with axes and guns and ideas about what belonged to them. And they'd been here the whole time, hidden, watching, surviving. Frank reached out, touched the bark. It was rough under his palm, warm despite the cold. Living. I see you, he whispered. The wind shifted. Behind him, a sound, soft, deliberate. He turned. The mother stood 10 feet away, the two young beside her, not hiding, just there. They looked at him. He looked at them. Nobody moved. Then the mother did something Frank would remember for the rest of his life, however long that was. She reached into the hollow, pulled something out, and walked forward, stopped right in front of him, opened her hand. A stone. Small, smooth, a hole worn through the center. She held it out. Frank's hand shook as he took it. The stone was warm, heavy, real. She touched his chest again, right over his heart, held it there, and Frank understood. This wasn't goodbye. This was something else. Something deeper. A connection that would last longer than words, longer than time. She stepped back. The young ones stepped forward, each touching his hands briefly, their touch gentle, almost curious. Then they turned and walked into the hollow, one by one. The mother last, looking back once before disappearing into the darkness. Frank stood there, stone in his hand, tears freezing on his face. He waited. They didn't come out. Finally, as the sun began to set, turning the snow gold and the shadows long, Frank turned and started the long walk back. His legs barely worked. His lungs burned with every breath. But he walked, one step at a time. The stone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. He made it down the ridge, made it through the woods, made it back to the cabin as the last light faded from the sky. Inside, he built the fire, sat in his chair, set the stone on the table next to the other three. 4 now, mother, 2 young, and him. A family. Strange and impossible, and real. He picked up the cassette tape, put on his coat, walked out to the truck. The engine started. The tape played. Katie's voice filled the cab. Okay, Dad, this one's for when you need to remember you're not alone. The opening chords of Born to Run kicked in. Frank sat there, watching the stars come out, watching the woods. In the trees, at the edge of the clearing, 4 shapes stood, watching back. Frank smiled. I know, he said. I know. The days that followed were harder. February gave way to March. The cold eased slightly, but not much. Frank's body was failing faster now. Some mornings he couldn't get out of bed. Other mornings he couldn't remember getting into it. The doctor called once. Left a message. Frank didn't call back. He knew what the doctor would say, knew there was nothing to be done about it. He spent his days by the fire, reading old books he'd read before, looking at the photograph, holding the stones. Sometimes he walked outside, not far, just to the edge of the clearing. He'd stand there, looking at the woods, and they'd be there. Not always visible, but present. He could feel them. Once, the smaller of the 2 young ones came out of the trees, stood 20 feet away, held up something, a branch with early buds, the first sign of spring. Frank held up his hand. The young one set the branch down, turned, and disappeared. Frank collected the branch, brought it inside, set it in a jar of water on the windowsill. The buds opened slowly. Small white flowers, delicate and perfect. March became April. The snow began to melt in earnest, water running everywhere, the ground soft and giving beneath his boots. Frank didn't leave the cabin much now. The pain had settled in his chest permanently, a weight that made every breath a negotiation. He knew what was coming, had known since winter, maybe longer. Some nights he'd wake gasping, Linda's name on his lips, reaching for her side of the bed, finding nothing. Some nights he'd dream of Katie, 5 years old and laughing, running through a field he didn't recognize. Some nights he didn't dream at all. The stones sat on the table. He'd moved them to be near the photograph. 4 stones, 4 souls, connected by something he couldn't name. On the morning of April 18th, Frank woke before dawn. The pain was different today. Sharper, more insistent. He knew. He dressed slowly, put on his best shirt, the flannel Linda had given him for Christmas in '89, still holding the shape of her hands in the way it had been folded. Put on her coat. The smell was faint now, almost gone, but still there if you knew where to look. He picked up the 4 stones, put them in his pocket, picked up the cassette tape, put it in his other pocket, walked to the door. The morning was soft, spring soft, the kind of morning that promised warmth later, promised growth, promised life. Birds sang in the trees. The creek ran full, music against stones. Frank walked into the woods, not the path to the ridge, a different way, following something that wasn't quite sound, wasn't quite sight, just knowing. His legs gave out twice. Each time he got back up, kept walking. The pain in his chest spread, down his left arm, up his neck. He knew this feeling, knew what it meant. Not yet, he said, just a little further. The woods opened into a small meadow, grass just starting to green, wildflowers pushing up through the wet earth. The sun breaking through the trees, throwing gold across everything. And there, in the center of the meadow, standing in a line, waiting, the mother, the 2 young, and 3 others Frank had never seen. Tall and ancient, their fur silver gray, their eyes deep and knowing. 6 of them, a family, generations. Frank walked forward, each step harder than the last. His vision blurred at the edges. The pain was enormous now, crushing, total. He made it to the center of the meadow, stopped 10 feet from them, reached into his pocket, pulled out the 4 stones, held them out. The mother stepped forward, took them gently from his hand, looked at him with something that might have been gratitude, might have been love, might have been recognition of something even older. Frank's knees gave. He went down slow, catching himself on one hand. The grass was wet and cold and perfect. The young ones moved forward, sat on either side of him, not touching, just present. The pain peaked, crested, became something else. Frank looked up at the mother, at the others, at the sky beyond them, blue and infinite. "Thank you," he said. His vision dimmed. The pain receded. He felt the grass beneath his palm, heard the creek, heard Katie's voice, faint and far away, saying, "It's okay, Dad." He felt Linda's hand in his. Warm, real. He closed his eyes, opened them again. The world looked different. The colors brighter, the sounds clearer. He could see the forest breathing, see the connections between things, root to tree, tree to sky, sky to earth. See the threads that held everything together. He looked at his hands. They didn't hurt anymore. The mother reached down, offered her hand. Frank took it. She pulled him up. Or he stood. He wasn't sure. Didn't matter. The others stepped back, forming a circle, not trapping, honoring. The mother looked at him, really looked. And Frank Novak, 67 years old, broken and tired, and finally free, looked back. The meadow held its breath. The creek sang. The birds went silent. Then the mother turned. The others followed, moving toward the trees, toward the deep places, toward wherever it was they went when the world got too heavy. Frank turned too. Behind him, in the grass, something remained. A shape, still and quiet, wearing a flannel shirt and an old coat, hands folded, face peaceful. But Frank kept walking, into the trees, into the shadows, into the places where the names we give things don't matter anymore, where the only truth is presence, is connection, is the knowledge that nothing is ever really lost. The sun rose higher, the meadow warmed, the grass grew tall, and somewhere, deep in the Huron Mountains, in a place you won't find on any map, in a hollow at the base of an ancient tree, 7 stones sit in a careful arrangement. 4 smooth river stones with holes worn through their centers. 3 new ones, rough and unfinished, placed by hands that remembered what it meant to care. The rangers found Frank's cabin 3 days later. Door open, fire cold. Everything neat and orderly except for the photograph on the mantel, which had fallen and shattered, the glass scattered across the floor like stars. His truck was there, his rifle, his boots by the door. Frank was not. They searched the woods for 2 weeks, brought in dogs, brought in helicopters, found nothing, no tracks, no body, no sign he'd ever left. Just a clearing in the woods, a meadow full of wildflowers, and at the center, pressed deep into the soft earth, tracks, large and small, leading into the trees, leading north, leading somewhere the searchers didn't follow, couldn't follow, shouldn't follow. Some doors only open once. Some paths are only for those who earned them. The cabin still stands, empty now. The rangers check on it twice a year. Everything is exactly as Frank left it, except the windowsill, where the 4 stones used to sit. There's a bundle of evergreen branches tied with grass. Fresh, always fresh. Nobody knows who puts it there. Nobody asks. The woods keep their secrets. And on quiet mornings, when the mist rises from the creek and the sun hasn't quite broken through, if you're very still and very quiet and you're not trying too hard to see, you might catch a glimpse. 7 shapes moving through the trees. One smaller than the others, moving like he's still learning the rhythm, still figuring out how to walk in a body that doesn't hurt anymore, still learning that some families aren't built from blood. Some families are built from choice. From standing up, when standing up costs everything. From opening your door in a storm and saying yes. From finally getting it right. The wind moves through the pines. The creek sings its eternal song. The mountains stand patient and old, holding their stories close. And somewhere in the deep green, in the places where human maps turn blank and uncertain, where the trees grow so thick, the sun barely touches earth, they're still there, still watching, still waiting, still remembering the man who chose mercy over fear, who chose standing over silence, who chose, in his final winter, to finally live the way his daughter always knew he could. Frank Novak went into the woods in April of '96. He never came back. But sometimes, late at night, if the wind is right and you're listening close, you can hear music, faint and far away. Springsteen, maybe, or something older. Something that sounds like home. The woods don't explain themselves. They don't need to. Some stories end. Others just move deeper, where we can't follow, where we're not meant to, where the only truth is the one you feel in your chest when you stand at the edge of the clearing and realize you're not alone. You never were. The forest breathes. The creek remembers. The mountains hold their vigil, and in the spaces between the trees, in the silence that listens, in the darkness that protects rather than threatens, something wild and gentle and infinitely patient continues, not ending, just being, which is all any of us ever really need. That's Frank's story. If you knew someone who finally got it right when it mattered, leave their name in the comments. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Margaret Brennan was 67 years old and hadn't spoken to another person in 3 weeks. Hit subscribe, comment what state you're watching from, and let me tell you what walked out of that storm. All right, here's Maggie's story. The cabin sat at the end of a 2-track road that Michigan winters like to erase. 20 miles from the nearest town, 15 from the nearest neighbor, and 5 years from the last time Maggie's daughter had bothered to visit. The numbers stacked up like cordwood. She knew them all by heart. She'd been a nurse for 32 years, St. Mary's Hospital in Marquette, labor and delivery mostly, though she'd done her time in ER when they were short-staffed. She knew how to read a body's distress signals, how to stay calm when panic tried to crowd the room, how to deliver bad news with enough gentleness that people could still breathe after hearing it. Those skills didn't count for much out here. Out here, she counted other things. Days since Tom died, months since Claire called, years since her hands stopped shaking enough to go back to work. The cabin had been Tom's dream. 40 acres of pine and hardwood in the Upper Peninsula, a place to fish and hunt and pretend the world hadn't gotten too loud. He'd built most of it himself over 3 summers, cutting corners where he could, splurging on a decent wood stove because Maggie had insisted. They were going to retire here together. That was the plan. Cancer had other ideas. Now it was just Maggie and the silence. The silence had weight. It pressed against the windows at night, settled into the corners during the day, filled the spaces where conversation used to live. Some people couldn't stand it. Maggie had learned to carry it like a second coat, heavy but familiar. December in the UP wasn't gentle. The cold came down from Canada with teeth, bit through thermal underwear and long johns, found the gaps in window frames and door seals, made itself at home in your bones. Snow didn't just fall, it accumulated. 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, piling up against the cabin walls until the first floor windows looked out at white nothing. The road disappeared first, then the clearing, then the tree line. Eventually the world became a study in shades of gray and white, sky and snow trading places until you couldn't tell which was which. Maggie knew how to manage. You learned quick up here, or you didn't make it. She kept the woodshed stacked, the propane tanks full, the pantry loaded with canned goods and dried beans and coffee. Lots of coffee. She'd been a 2-pot-a-day nurse, and retirement hadn't changed that. Every morning she woke at 6 out of habit, though there was nowhere to be. She'd fire up the stove, put the kettle on, stand at the kitchen window watching the light change over the trees. Her body had aged in ways that surprised her. 67 wasn't old. Her mother had made it to 93, but her hands told a different story. Arthritis had crept into the knuckles, made them stiff and swollen on cold mornings. Her right knee complained about the cabin's steep stairs. Her back protested when she split wood, though she did it anyway because the alternative was freezing. The bottle of tramadol in the medicine cabinet was supposed to last 3 months. It lasted 6 weeks. She didn't drink much. A glass of whiskey after dinner, sometimes 2 if the silence got too heavy. Tom's Jameson, the bottle she'd bought for him the Christmas before he got sick. She'd been rationing it for 5 years, making it last, because opening a new bottle felt like admitting he was really gone. The photographs on the mantel told the story in reverse. Claire at 25, college graduation, University of Minnesota, full of plans. Claire at 16, sullen and angry, the year everything went wrong. Claire at 8, gap-toothed and laughing, before she learned that her mother worked too much and her father drank too much, and families were supposed to be different than theirs was. The frames had dust on them. Maggie wiped them down every Sunday out of habit, but she'd stopped really looking at them. Looking hurt worse than not looking. Claire lived in Phoenix now, married to a man Maggie had met exactly once, working for some tech company doing something with data that Maggie didn't understand. They talked maybe 3 times a year, birthday calls that lasted 10 minutes, full of pleasant nothing. How's the weather? How's work? How's Dave? Fine, fine, fine. The conversations circled like a plane that couldn't land, burning fuel, going nowhere. Maggie knew it was her fault. Not all of it, but enough of it. She'd worked too many doubles when Claire was young, missed too many school plays and soccer games and parent-teacher conferences. Tom had been there, mostly, when he wasn't working construction or drinking away what the work couldn't fix. But kids didn't want their father at the mother-daughter tea. They wanted their mother. And Maggie had been at the hospital, elbow deep in someone else's emergency. Always someone else's emergency, because she was good at emergencies and terrible at being present. By the time she'd really noticed, that her daughter had grown up angry and distant, it was too late. Claire left for college and never really came back. She'd visit at Christmas the first few years, suffer through awkward dinners and forced conversation, then escape back to Minnesota and eventually Arizona, and a life that didn't include much room for her parents. Maggie couldn't blame her. She'd chosen her patience over her daughter 1,000 times. You didn't get to undo that math. The days followed a pattern. Wake at 6, coffee and oatmeal. Check the stove. Split wood if the pile was getting low. Read for an hour mysteries mostly, the kind where everything got solved in the end and justice was tidy. Make lunch. Check the stove again. Maybe walk the perimeter of the clearing if the snow wasn't too deep, just to move her body. Prove it still worked. More coffee. Make dinner. 1 glass of whiskey. Maybe 2. Bed by 9. The pattern held her upright. Without it, she'd drift. Without it, the silence would win. The radio brought news from the outside world, though she didn't always listen. Political noise, weather warnings, the small tragedies of people she'd never meet. It felt distant, like watching television with the sound off. Real life was the cabin, the stove, the routine. Everything else was just pictures moving behind glass. Some nights the phone rang, telemarketer usually, or a wrong number. Once in a while it was her brother in Milwaukee, checking in, making sure she hadn't frozen or fallen or given up. She told him she was fine. The word had lost its meaning somewhere along the way. Fine meant breathing. Fine meant functional. Fine meant she could still split wood and make coffee and wake up at 6, like a person with somewhere to be. She didn't think about whether she was happy. Happy felt like a word from another language, one she'd studied once but never really learned to speak. She was surviving. That counted for something. The storm warning started 3 days before it hit. The weather service out of Marquette called for heavy snow, high winds, temperatures dropping to 20 below. Nothing new for December, but this one had weight behind it. The meteorologist, a kid who looked 12, but probably wasn't used words like significant accumulation and blizzard conditions and avoid unnecessary travel. Maggie listened with half an ear while chopping onions for chili. She'd lived through plenty of storms. You stocked up, stayed inside, waited it out. She made a run to town the day before it hit. Hancock was the closest thing to civilization, a small city perched on the edge of the Keweenaw Waterway, built on copper mining and hanging on through tourism and stubbornness. The grocery store was packed with people doing the same last-minute panic shopping. She grabbed extra batteries, another bag of coffee, some canned soup she didn't really need. At the checkout, the cashier, a woman about her age with kind eyes and a Packers sweatshirt, said, "You staying out at the Brennan place?" "Yeah." "You got enough wood?" "Always." "Good. This one's supposed to be mean." The woman smiled, but it was worried around the edges. "You got somebody checking on you?" Maggie thought about lying, making up a neighbor or a friend who'd call. Instead, she said, "I've got a phone." The woman nodded, but the worry didn't leave her face. "You take care out there." "Always do." The drive back took 40 minutes on roads that were already getting slick. Snow had started falling, light but steady, the kind that meant business. The 2-track to the cabin was barely visible under white. Her truck, Tom's truck, really, a '98 Silverado that ran on prayer and Spite handled it fine. 4-wheel drive and good tires and the weight of a plow blade on the front. She'd learned to drive in snow when she moved up here 30 years ago. You learned or you didn't last. The cabin looked small against the trees, smoke rising from the chimney into grey sky. She'd left the stove burning low, enough to keep the pipes from freezing while she was gone. Now she built it back up, adding logs until heat pushed into every corner. The wind was picking up, rattling the windows in their frames, making the whole structure creak like an old ship. She didn't mind the sound. It meant the cabin was talking to her, telling her it was still solid, still holding. By evening, The storm had arrived in earnest. Snow came sideways, driven by wind that howled through the trees like something wild and hurt. Visibility dropped to nothing. The clearing vanished. The woodshed disappeared. The world ended at the windows and became white noise, white nothing, white forever. Maggie made herself dinner, the chili she'd started 2 days ago, warmed up and served with cornbread, and ate it at the kitchen table, while the storm tried to tear the cabin apart. The stove roared. The windows shook. The radio crackled with static and warnings about staying off the roads. She poured herself a whiskey and watched the fire through the stove's glass door, flames dancing behind sooted glass, making shapes that almost looked like something. She thought about Claire, not the angry teenager or the distant adult, but the little girl who used to climb into her lap during thunderstorms, small and scared, and certain that her mother could fix anything. Maggie had believed it too back then. She'd thought being good at fixing people meant she could fix her family, her daughter, herself. It turned out you couldn't set a broken relationship like a broken bone. Some things didn't heal straight no matter how well you splinted them. The wind shifted, came at the cabin from a different angle. Snow piled against the north wall, building a drift that would be 6 feet high by morning. Maggie checked the stove one more time, made sure the damper was set right, then settled into Tom's recliner with a mystery novel. The detective was tracking a killer through Manhattan streets. It felt like a story from another planet. She must have dozed off. The book slipped from her hands and hit the floor, waking her. The cabin was darker now. The fire had burned low. Outside, the storm screamed like it had found a voice. She checked her watch. 11:47. Time to bank the fire and go to bed. She was reaching for another log when she heard it. A knock. Not the wind, not a branch. A knock. Heavy, deliberate, shaking the door in its frame. Maggie froze. Nobody came to the cabin during storms. Nobody could. The road was gone. Her nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. She waited, telling herself it was the wind finding a new way to rattle things. The knock came again, heavier this time, insistent. Her heart kicked up, pumping adrenaline into blood that didn't move as fast as it used to. She stood slowly, joints protesting, and reached for the lantern on the table. The light pushed back the darkness, but didn't make anything clearer. The door was solid pine, no window, no way to see what was on the other side. Who's there? Her voice came out stronger than she felt. No answer. Just the wind and the storm and something breathing on the other side of the door. Maggie's training kicked in without permission. She'd seen enough emergencies to know that hesitation killed people. If someone was out there in this storm, they needed help. If it was something else, well, she'd figure that out when she opened the door. She grabbed the fire poker with her left hand. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. With her right hand, she pulled the latch and opened the door. The wind shoved inside, bringing snow and cold, and a figure that filled the doorway like darkness made solid. Maggie's brain tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Too tall, too broad, covered in fur that was matted with ice. Arms like tree trunks, hands that could palm her head like a basketball, and eyes. Dark eyes that held her gaze with something that looked almost human. Almost, but not quite. The creature, because it was a creature, 8 feet of muscle and fur, and impossible existence, held something against its chest. Something small and weak that made a sound like a kitten crying. Maggie's hand tightened on the poker. Every instinct except one screamed at her to slam the door and lock it and pretend this wasn't happening. But that one instinct, the nurse, the part of her that had spent 3 decades responding to distress signals, saw past the impossible exterior to the reality underneath. This was a mother. This was a mother holding a sick child, and she was begging for help. The creature didn't move forward. She stayed in the doorway, snow swirling around her massive frame, breath coming in visible clouds. Her eyes never left Maggie's face. She was waiting, asking, pleading without words in a language that transcended species. The child made that sound again, weak, wet, desperate. Maggie's decision took less than 3 seconds. She'd made faster ones in the ER, life or death choices, with no time to second guess. This was the same. This was someone who needed help, and she was someone who knew how to help. She stepped back and opened the door wider. The creature lowered her head, courtesy or necessity. Maggie couldn't tell, and stepped inside. Snow followed her, melting instantly in the cabin's heat, creating puddles on the floor. She moved with surprising care, trying not to break anything, her massive body somehow delicate in the small space. Maggie closed the door. The storm's scream became muffled again, pushed back outside, where it belonged. The cabin was suddenly crowded with something impossible, something that shouldn't exist but very clearly did. "By the fire," Maggie said, pointing with the poker. "Gently now." The creature moved toward the stove, slow and careful. She lowered herself to the floor with a grace that didn't match her size, curling her body around the child in her arms. Up close, Maggie could see the child more clearly, smaller, thinner, with patches of fur that looked wrong, matted and brittle. Its breathing was shallow and rapid. Its eyes were half closed. Hypothermia. Maggie recognized the signs instantly. Maybe worse. She set the poker down. It was useless anyway, and grabbed the wool blankets from her bed, 2 of them thick and heavy. She brought them to the fire and laid them near the creature without getting too close. "For the little one," she said, pointing to the child. The creature watched her with those dark, intelligent eyes. After a moment, she took one blanket and wrapped it carefully around the child, tucking it in with hands that were surprisingly dexterous. Long fingers, almost human in shape, working with a mother's precision. Maggie's nurse brain was running through protocols. Warm them gradually, fluids if conscious. Check for frostbite. Monitor breathing. She moved to the kitchen and filled a large bowl with lukewarm water. Not hot, never hot, that could shock a hypothermic system. She brought it back along with a clean towel. The creature watched every movement, tension visible in the set of her shoulders. Maggie set the bowl down within reach, but not too close. "For cleaning," she said, miming wiping and drinking, if the little one can manage it. She stepped back, giving space, showing she wasn't a threat. The creature reached out, slowly testing, maybe, or just being cautious, and touched the water with one finger. She seemed to understand. Carefully, she dipped the towel in the bowl and began cleaning the child's face, wiping away snow and ice with movements so gentle they made Maggie's throat tight. This wasn't an animal. This was a mother taking care of her baby the same way every mother in every species had done since the beginning of time. The child stirred, made a weak sound. The creature, the mother, bent close and made a sound back, low and rumbling, almost like humming, a lullaby in a voice that had never learned human words. Maggie stood by the fire, watching, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. 40 years ago, she'd held Claire like that. 40 years ago, she'd been the one wrapping blankets and wiping tears and making everything better with nothing but presence and touch. She'd forgotten how it felt, or maybe she'd just stopped letting herself remember. The mother finished cleaning the child's face and helped it drink from the bowl, supporting its head with one massive hand, guiding the water with a patience that broke something loose in Maggie's chest. When the child had drunk enough, the mother set the bowl aside and pulled it back against her chest, wrapping both arms around it, sharing her warmth. Only then did she look at Maggie again. In her eyes was something Maggie recognized from 30 years of nursing: gratitude, relief, and underneath both, the desperate exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting too long and didn't know if she could keep fighting. Maggie nodded once. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." The mother's shoulders sagged, just a little, just enough to show the weight she'd been carrying. She bent her head over the child and closed her eyes. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Inside, 3 beings shared warmth and silence and the fragile understanding that sometimes survival means trusting strangers. Maggie added more wood to the fire, keeping it steady but not too hot. She brought more blankets, another bowl of water, some dried venison she'd made last fall. She laid everything within reach of the mother and then retreated to the kitchen table, giving them space. The mother fed the child small pieces of meat, chewing them first to make them softer, then placing them gently in the child's mouth. It ate slowly, mechanically, like someone who'd forgotten what hunger felt like but knew they needed fuel. After 3 pieces, it turned its head away. The mother didn't push. She just tucked it back into the blankets and held it close. Maggie watched from across the room, drinking cold coffee and trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't possible. Bigfoot was a story, a legend, a thing people claimed to see in blurry photographs and never quite convincing videos. It wasn't real. It wasn't supposed to be real. But reality sat by her fire, breathing, bleeding heat into the small cabin, radiating exhaustion and desperation in equal measure. Reality had knocked on her door, asking for help, and Maggie had opened it, just like she'd opened 1,000 doors at the hospital, never asking if the person on the other side deserved help, just giving it. Some instincts ran too deep to question. Hours passed. The mother didn't sleep, just held the child and watched the fire. Occasionally, her gaze would drift to Maggie, measuring, assessing. Maggie stayed where she was, moving slowly when she needed to add wood or refill the water bowl, making her intentions clear through gesture, since words didn't seem to bridge whatever gap existed between them. Around 3 in the morning, the child's breathing changed. It went from shallow and rapid to deeper, more regular. The mother noticed immediately, her whole body relaxing just a fraction. She adjusted the blankets, checked the child's face with careful hands, made that humming sound again. The child stirred, nuzzled closer, and settled back into something that looked like actual sleep instead of unconscious surrender. The mother's eyes closed, just for a moment, maybe 30 seconds, before she forced them open again. But Maggie had seen it. The exhaustion, the toll this night had taken. "It's okay," Maggie said softly. "I'll keep watch. You rest." The mother looked at her. Maggie didn't know if she understood the words, but something in her expression must have communicated meaning. The mother's eyes closed again. This time they stayed closed. Her breathing deepened. Her grip on the child loosened just slightly, not letting go, never letting go, but relaxing enough to let sleep pull her under. Within minutes, she was out. Completely, deeply, the kind of exhausted sleep that came after running too far on empty for too long. Maggie sat in the quiet cabin, listening to the storm outside and the breathing inside. 2 creatures who shouldn't exist, sleeping by her fire because she'd made a choice to open a door instead of keeping it closed. She thought about calling someone, her brother, the sheriff, the newspaper, anyone who might want to know that impossible things were real after all. But who would she call? And what would she say? And what would they do when they got here? Take pictures, ask questions, turn this into a spectacle. Or worse, much worse, see these 2 as threats, problems, things that needed to be dealt with. No, this wasn't a story for sharing. This was something else, something private, something sacred. Maggie stood and moved closer to the fire, careful not to disturb them. The child slept peacefully now, color returning to its face. The mother's breathing was deep and even, her massive frame relaxed, in a way that suggested she hadn't felt safe enough to sleep in a long time. They'd trusted her, a human, the last thing they should trust. But desperation did strange math, made impossible choices seem reasonable. Maggie added another log to the fire. The wood caught, flames rising higher, pushing heat into the cabin. She settled back into the chair and pulled a blanket around her shoulders. Outside, the storm raged on, but in here, they were warm. In here, they were safe. For tonight, that was enough. Morning came gray and reluctant. The storm hadn't broken, if anything. It had dug in deeper, settled into the landscape like it planned to stay. Snow piled against the windows in drifts that reached halfway up the glass. The wind had changed direction sometime in the night, now coming from the east, driving snow into different corners, finding new ways to test the cabin's seams. Maggie woke stiff in the chair, her neck protesting the angle she'd slept at. The fire had burned low but not out. She'd woken twice in the night to add wood, some autopilot part of her brain refusing to let them freeze even while she slept. The mother and child were still by the hearth, both sleeping. The child's breathing was stronger now, more regular. Good sign. The mother had shifted in the night, repositioning herself to keep the child away from any drafts, her body a living windbreak. Maggie stood slowly, joints cracking like kindling. 67 felt like 87 this morning. She added logs to the fire, quiet as she could manage, then put the kettle on for coffee. The cabin's routine asserted itself, even with impossible guests. You woke up, you made coffee, you kept the fire going, the rest figured itself out. She was measuring grounds when she felt eyes on her. The mother was awake, watching. How long she'd been awake? Maggie couldn't say. Those dark eyes tracked every movement, alert but not alarmed. The child still slept, curled tight against her chest. "Morning," Maggie said, keeping her voice low. "You want some food?" The mother didn't respond, couldn't respond. Maybe, or just chose not to. But she watched as Maggie moved around the kitchen, assembling breakfast. Oatmeal, dried fruit, honey, the venison from last night. She made 2 bowls, one for herself, one for them, and brought the second bowl to the hearth, setting it on the floor within reach. The mother looked at it, looked at Maggie. Some calculation happened behind those eyes, weighing risk against need. Finally, she reached out, took the bowl, and sniffed it carefully. Satisfied, she set it aside and woke the child with gentle touches, coaxing it back to consciousness. The little one stirred, whimpered, opened its eyes. They were clearer today, more focused. It looked at its mother, then at Maggie, then back to its mother. The mother made a low-sound reassurance, maybe, and offered it the bowl. The child ate, slowly at first, then with more interest. It finished half the oatmeal before pushing it away, satisfied. The mother finished the rest, efficient and quick, like someone who'd learned not to waste food or time. When the bowl was empty, she set it down and met Maggie's eyes again. Something passed between them, not words, not even understanding, really, just acknowledgement. You helped us. I know you helped us. Thank you doesn't translate across species, but gratitude does. It lives in the angle of shoulders, the softness of eyes, the way one being recognizes debt to another. Maggie nodded. You're welcome. The day unfolded in strange domesticity. The storm kept them trapped. No one was going anywhere in this weather, so they settled into sharing space. The mother stayed close to the fire, keeping the child warm, watching Maggie with that constant vigilance that never quite became trust, but edged closer to it with each passing hour. Maggie went about her routine, modified for company. She swept the melted snow that had pooled by the door. She prepared food and left it within reach. She added wood to the fire every hour, keeping the temperature steady. She moved slowly, deliberately, making sure there were no sudden movements that might startle them. The child grew stronger throughout the day. By afternoon, it was sitting up on its own, looking around with open curiosity. It watched Maggie with huge dark eyes, taking in this strange creature that walked on 2 legs like its mother, but was smaller, weaker, covered in cloth instead of fur. Once, Maggie smiled at it. The child blinked, then tentatively, almost experimentally, it smiled back. Sort of. The expression wasn't quite human, but the intent was clear, the mother noticed. Her posture changed, relaxed just a degree. If the child felt safe, maybe she could feel safe too. By evening, the storm still showed no sign of breaking. Maggie checked her supplies while making dinner. She had enough food for maybe a week if she stretched it. The propane would last longer. Wood wasn't a problem, the shed was stacked full, and she could always split more. What worried her was the isolation. If this storm lasted more than a few days, if something went wrong, if someone needed help, but who would need help? It was just her and them, and they seemed to be managing. She made stew that night, thick with vegetables and the last of the venison, and brought a full pot to share. The mother took it carefully, tested the temperature with one finger, then helped the child eat directly from the pot. They shared the food between them, the mother always making sure the child ate first, ate more, ate enough. Maggie watched them from the table, eating her own portion. Motherhood looked the same everywhere, apparently. The sacrifice, the putting another first, the constant calculation of what the child needed versus what you could provide. She'd done it too, once upon a time. Before the job consumed her, before she chose other people's children over her own so many times that her own stopped needing her, the mother caught her watching. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Two women who'd both known what it meant to hold a child and promised to keep it safe. Two women who'd both failed in different ways. Two women who were trying, even now, even here, to get it right. The second night passed quieter than the first. The mother slept more soundly, trusting enough to let exhaustion win. The child slept curled against her, small chest rising and falling in easy rhythm. Maggie kept watch from the chair, adding wood when needed, drifting in and out of sleep that wasn't quite restful but was enough. She dreamed about Claire. Not the real Claire, the adult woman in Phoenix who barely called, but the child Claire, the one who'd believed her mother could fix anything. In the dream, Claire was small and sick, and Maggie was holding her, rocking her, making those soft shushing sounds that mothers make. But when she looked down, the face wasn't Claire's. It was the creature's child, looking up at her with those dark eyes, trusting her to make everything better. She woke with tears on her face. The cabin was dark except for the fire's glow. The mother and child slept on. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the silence between howls felt heavy with all the things Maggie couldn't say and couldn't fix and couldn't undo. The third day brought a slight break in the storm. The snow stopped falling around noon, though the wind continued its assault. Visibility improved enough to see the tree line again, barely. The world was buried under white, drifts sculpted into strange shapes by the relentless wind. The mother noticed the change. She stood for the first time in 2 days, rising to her full height, head nearly touching the cabin's low ceiling. She moved to the window and looked out, reading the weather with senses Maggie couldn't understand. The child watched her from the floor, making small questioning sounds. The mother returned to the fire and settled back down, but something had shifted. She was restless now, checking the window every hour, listening to the wind, calculating something Maggie couldn't see, planning maybe, or just recognizing that they couldn't stay here forever. That night, Maggie woke to the sound of crying, not the child, the mother. She sat hunched in the corner, her massive frame shaking with silent sobs. The child held tight against her chest. The little one slept on, unaware. But the mother was breaking apart in the darkness. Maggie had seen this before, not in creatures from legends, but in humans at the hospital. The moment when the crisis had passed, but the cost suddenly became real. The moment when you understood that you'd almost lost everything, and the terror you'd been suppressing came flooding back all at once. She didn't move from the chair, didn't speak, didn't try to offer comfort that couldn't cross the species divide. She just sat in the darkness and witnessed it. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes knowing you weren't alone in the breaking was all the help anyone could give. The mother cried for maybe 20 minutes. Then she wiped her face with one massive hand, adjusted her hold on the child, and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she looked directly at Maggie. The look said, "I know you saw that. Thank you for not pretending you didn't." Maggie nodded. Some things didn't need words. The fourth day, the storm broke completely. The wind died to nothing. The sun emerged, pale and cold, turning the snow-covered landscape into something almost beautiful. The silence felt wrong after so many days of howling, too quiet, too still, like the world was holding its breath. The mother stood at the window for a long time that morning, the child in her arms, both of them looking out at the changed world. Maggie could see the decision forming. Time to go. Time to leave, before the roads cleared, and people came and questions got asked that couldn't be answered. She'd known this moment was coming, had known it since the first night, but knowing didn't make it easier. The mother turned from the window, and looked at Maggie. Really looked at her, with an intensity that felt like being seen all the way through. Then she did something unexpected. She set the child down on the floor gently, carefully, and took a step toward Maggie. Maggie's heart kicked up, some primal part of her brain screaming danger. But she didn't move, didn't reach for the poker, just stood there while this impossible being crossed the small cabin and stopped an arm's length away. The mother reached into the thick fur at her neck and pulled something free. A stone, smooth and dark, hanging from a woven cord made of plant fibers. She held it out to Maggie. Maggie looked at the stone, then at the mother's face. "I can't take that. It's yours." But the mother pressed it into Maggie's hand, closing her fingers around it. The stone was warm from being worn against skin. The cord was soft with age. This wasn't just a rock on a string. This meant something. The mother stepped back, satisfied. She returned to the child and lifted it into her arms. The little one wrapped its arms around her neck, ready to leave, trusting its mother to know the way. Maggie followed them to the door, the stone heavy in her palm. She opened it, and cold air rushed in, sharp enough to hurt. The mother paused at the threshold, looked back one more time. In that look was everything: gratitude and farewell, and the acknowledgement that this had been real, that it had mattered, that neither of them would forget. Then she stepped out into the snow. Her feet sank deep, but she moved with purpose, carrying the child toward the tree line. Maggie watched from the doorway, wind biting at her face as they crossed the clearing. At the edge of the trees, the mother turned back. She raised one hand, a wave, maybe, or just acknowledgement. The child did the same, small hand mimicking its mother's gesture. Maggie raised her hand in return. The mother and child turned and walked into the forest. Within seconds, the trees swallowed them. The white world erased their tracks, almost as fast as they made them. Maggie stood in the doorway until she couldn't stand the cold anymore, then stepped back inside and closed the door. The cabin felt enormous suddenly, empty in a way it hadn't felt empty before. The fire still burned. The blankets still lay by the hearth. But the presence that had filled the space was gone, taken back by the wilderness that had birthed it. She looked down at the stone in her hand. Dark gray, smooth as glass, probably worn that way by centuries of being touched. The cord was intricate, woven in a pattern that suggested intelligence, intention, artistry. This wasn't just a gift. This was a piece of someone's life, given freely to say what words couldn't. Maggie closed her fingers around it and sat down in the chair by the fire. The days after moved slowly. The storm had passed, but the snow remained, deep enough to keep her trapped for another week. She fell back into routine coffee and oatmeal, tending the fire, reading mysteries where everything got solved and justice prevailed. But the cabin felt different now. Haunted wasn't the right word. Inhabited, maybe, marked by something that had happened here. She didn't tell anyone. When her brother called on the satellite phone to check if she'd survived the storm, she said she was fine. Fine. That word again. When the road finally cleared enough for her to drive to town, she picked up supplies and chatted with the cashier about the weather and went home without mentioning the impossible thing that had knocked on her door. Who would believe her? More importantly, what would happen if they did? People would come, scientists, journalists, hunters. They'd want proof. They'd want to find them. They'd want to turn mystery into spectacle, wonder into commodity. No, some things weren't meant to be shared. Some things you kept in the quiet places of your heart and let them change you without explanation. Winter eased towards spring in the way UP winters did reluctantly, with false starts and sudden storms that reminded you not to get cocky. Maggie split wood and made coffee and watched the tree line. Sometimes, in the blue hour between day and night, she thought she saw movement at the edge of the clearing, large shapes moving between trees, but maybe it was just shadows. Maybe it was just hope. She wore the stone around her neck, tucked under her shirt where no one could see it. The weight of it against her sternum felt like a reminder. You were there. It happened. You opened the door when you could have kept it closed. The phone rang one evening in March. Maggie almost didn't answer, probably a telemarketer, but something made her pick up. "Mom?" Claire's voice. Maggie's heart did something complicated. "Claire, hi." Silence on the line, the kind that stretched too far, full of all the things neither of them knew how to say. "I was thinking about coming to visit," Claire said finally. "If that's okay, maybe next month?" Maggie looked at the photographs on the mantel. The dust had settled again despite her Sunday cleanings. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, that would be good." "Okay." Claire sounded surprised, like she'd expected an excuse. "Okay, I'll text you dates." "All right." More silence. Then, "You doing okay up there? You sound different." Maggie touched the stone through her shirt. "I'm fine. Just been a long winter. They always are up there." "Yeah, they always are." They said goodbye and hung up, and Maggie sat in the quiet cabin, feeling like something had shifted. Not fixed. You couldn't fix years of distance with one phone call, but shifted, opened, made space for possibility. April brought green to the trees and birdsong to the mornings. Maggie walked the perimeter of the clearing more often now, her knee protesting less as the weather warmed. She'd find things sometimes. A print in soft earth that was too large to be anything known. Branches arranged in patterns that felt deliberate. Once, a deer carcass left at the edge of her property, cleaned and butchered with precision, more meat than she could use before it spoiled. She took what she needed and left the rest for the forest. Fair trade. Claire came in May, driving up from Minneapolis in a rental car, looking tired and uncertain. They hugged at the door, awkward, brief, and then Claire stepped inside and looked around like she was seeing the cabin for the first time. "It's smaller than I remember," she said. "Everything is," Maggie replied. They spent 3 days together, not fixing anything, not resolving anything, just existing in the same space, relearning how to be around each other. They cooked meals together and walked the property and sat by the fire in the evenings. Claire talked about her job, her marriage, the life she'd built in Phoenix. Maggie listened and asked questions and tried not to say all the things she wanted to say about the past. On the last evening, they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun go down when Claire said, "I've been angry at you for a long time." Maggie's hands tightened on her coffee mug. "I know, I'm tired of being angry." "Me too." Claire looked at her. "I don't know how to not be angry. I don't know what comes after." "Neither do I." Maggie pulled the stone from under her shirt, let it catch the dying light. "But maybe we figure it out. Maybe we just keep trying." "What's that?" Claire pointed at the stone. "A gift," Maggie said, "from someone who needed help. Reminded me that sometimes you just have to open the door, even when you're scared." Claire studied her mother's face. "That's very zen of you." "I'm 67. I get to be zen." They smiled at each other. Small smiles. Tentative, but real. It was something. Claire left the next morning with promises to visit again, maybe in the fall. Maggie stood in the driveway and waved until the rental car disappeared down the 2-track. Then she went inside, made more coffee, and sat by the window. The forest looked back at her, patient, eternal, full of mysteries it would never explain. Summer came and went. Maggie turned 68 in July, celebrated alone with a slice of store-bought cake and a glass of whiskey. Her knee got worse. Her hands hurt more. She split less wood and bought more. Small concessions to age. The cabin needed repairs. The roof leaked in 2 places. The porch steps were rotting, but she couldn't manage them alone anymore. She thought about calling someone, getting help, but never quite did. In August, she woke to find offerings at her door. Berries in a woven basket. Mushrooms arranged on a flat stone. Herbs she didn't recognize, but smelled medicinal. She left out food in return: bread, dried meat, jars of honey, an exchange without words. A conversation conducted in gifts. Some mornings, she'd drink her coffee and feel watched, not threatened, just observed, remembered. She'd raise her mug to the tree line in salute. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes she'd see movement in response. A shadow shifting, a branch swaying against the wind. The mysteries stayed mysterious. The questions remained unanswered. And somehow that felt right. Some things weren't meant to be explained or understood or shared. Some things were meant to be carried quietly, held close, allowed to change you without demanding proof or reason. Fall arrived with its usual fury of color. The maples turned red and gold. The birches went yellow. The whole forest became a painting of impermanence. Maggie walked through it with her bad knee and her aching hands and the stone heavy against her heart, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, exactly. Not peace, but maybe acceptance. Maybe gratitude. She'd spent most of her life believing she had to fix everything, save everyone, make it all better through sheer force of will and medical knowledge. She'd worn herself out trying to heal a world that kept breaking, and in the process had broken her own family, her own daughter, her own heart. But that night in the storm, she'd done something different. She hadn't tried to fix or understand or explain. She'd just opened the door, let the impossible in, shared what she had without asking for anything back. And somehow that had been enough. October came cold and early. The first snow fell on the 15th, light but insistent, a reminder that winter was returning. Maggie brought in more wood, checked her supplies, prepared for another season of isolation. But the isolation felt different now. Less like punishment, more like choice. She stood at the window one evening, watching the snow fall blue in the twilight. The forest was quiet, the clearing was empty, but she felt presence anyway. Out there, beyond the trees, in the places humans didn't go, there were others enduring their own winters, keeping their own secrets, surviving. She touched the stone under her shirt and whispered, "Stay warm." The trees didn't answer, but they listened. And somewhere in the darkness between them, something listened back. Maggie turned from the window and added wood to the fire. The cabin filled with warmth. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering tracks, erasing evidence, keeping mysteries mysterious. That's it. Thanks for listening.